G. Smith, 2619 Dunbar, Dunbar Drive, Lansing, Michigan, 48906. Phone 517-321-4343. And Helen J. Earley of the Oldsmobile History Center. 8 a.m. Friday, September 21, 1990. Well, we're in business here.
Okay. I'm Tom Smith, currently residing in Lansing, phone number 321-4343. And Helen asked me to come in and talk a little bit about my experiences with Oldsmobile, which go back to, as far as General Motors, 1949, Oldsmobile, 1950. And I started in General Motors in the sales section and the floors of the exhibit section in the General Motors building in Detroit. Started in to kind of wait a year to try to get into medical school, and never went back. So I stayed with General Motors from the time I graduated from college until I retired in 1987.
What did you do in the exhibit section?
Well, having no experience at that, and majored in biology, and in fact I had two majors, biology and English, and had to take a pick of which one I wanted to take a degree in, and I chose biology, figuring there were fewer bachelors of science around than there were Bachelor of Arts. And they put you through a semi-formal training program on all of GM's automobiles, refrigerated products, including washers, dryers, Delco furnaces, Allison jet engines. Everything that General Motors produced was shown in one of the 5 exhibit rooms, and my job, as were the other people on the floor, was to talk to the public when they came in, and to the best of our ability answer their questions about any General Motors product. If they were interested in an automobile, we were to fill out a card which went to the local zone office for the division, and they forwarded that to a dealer. And supposedly we were rated directly in only one way, and that was the number of prospect cards we turned in. We always assumed that there were some people on the floor that were looking in the phone book and filling out a lot of cards to get to make points with the bosses, which we didn't think was quite right. But it was a good training program, and the only thing you were told going in was that they knew from past experience that after you'd been on the floor about a year, you got pretty stale. You worked 1 week of days, which was from 10 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, and you worked Monday through Friday, and then you worked all day Saturday. Then you switched to nights, and the night shift was from 4 in the afternoon until 10 o'clock at night when the exhibit rooms closed. And in that week shift, you had to work most of Sunday. So it wasn't the pleasantest working hours, and bearing in mind you were trying to work your way out of that job and pretty much on your own. If you happen to contact somebody from an automotive division wandering around the floor during lunch hour, you tried to ingratiate yourself so that if he was looking for a warm body to work for him, that he might remember you. So that happened to me. In fact, I ran into a man who was regional manager with GMAC, Clarence Watson, and turned out he knew my father, who was also in the finance business but outside of General Motors, and he heard through a friend of his that there was an opening at Oldsmobile, and this was in the early spring of 1950, and right after New Year's, that one of the fellows in the Detroit zone, Ralph Thurston, had gone on vacation and had run into a bridge down in Indiana and permanently injured himself. He later worked in Oldsmobile in Lansing and had a completely dead arm. But they couldn't use him in the field anymore, and so they were looking for a replacement as an assistant car distributor in the Detroit zone for Oldsmobile. And Clarence had talked to Harry Gepp, who was the zone manager, and Ed Ruth was assistant zone manager, and Frank Calkins was car distributor. And I went up and interviewed all 3 of these gentlemen, and they said they would get back to me, but everything looked pretty good.
Who was regional manager?
At that point in time, I don't know. I don't remember at the time, but they called me a few days later and said that the changes had come about because they were sending a man down from Lansing to take that job. and they would keep me in mind. About 3 months later, they called, which would have been March, and they said that the workload in the Detroit zone had gotten heavier, and they couldn't offer me the same job, but they would offer me a job as a senior clerk. They were going to put 3 people in distribution. Would I be interested? And I said, yes, I would. So I ended up going up, and at this point in time, Harry Gepp had been transferred out, and he was no longer there, and Harry Banks was zone manager, replacing Harry Gepp. Ed Ruth was still there, and Frank Calkins, the car distributor, had been replaced by Ray Corey. And I ended up working for Bob Berger, who was the man who had come down from Lansing to fill in, to take that job that they had offered me. So in one respect, I became the first employee that ever worked for Bob Berger, which we've laughed about ever since. But I worked there then starting in March. And
what do you do in car distribution?
Well, car distribution in the zone is the job of taking whatever production has been allocated to the zone, and it's always done on a monthly basis at that point in time, and allocate those products that the zone is going to receive. As far as in that days, it was 76s, 78s, and 98s were the only cars we had, and allocate those to the dealers based on a predetermined formula of distribution.
Does the dealer have any input?
The dealer had no input into it at all. In fact, at that point in time, it was still being carried over from the Sloan plan, as they explained it to me. The Sloan plan took the number of cars that a dealer had sold prior to World War II, and using that as a mathematical formula within the zone, the dealer might have sold 0.20 of the cars that were sold in the zone. So every time an allocation came down to the zone for the next month's business, they would multiply it by 0.20, and that dealer would be allocated that number of cars rounded off, obviously, to 2 or 3, or if it was a small dealer, maybe only 1. And our job, Ray Corey being the car distributor and Bob and I being his 2 assistants, our job was to break down the allocation for the 138 dealers that existed in the Detroit zone, and try to match up the allocation with the orders the dealer had submitted, and taking into consideration that the dealer had sold orders. In other words, he had written an order for an individual, a specific individual. And obviously that was the car he was most interested in obtaining. So we would look at what he would send us was what we call a preference list. A preference list was a list of the cars the dealer wanted to receive the following month. And trying to go from the number 1 on his list, which normally would be a sold order that he had written for a customer, and going on down the list to the stock cars that he wanted to put into his stock. And we tried to match up our allocation in the zone with obviously the number 1 or number 2 choices on that dealer's list. And this was done on a weekly basis.
Well, would you have the option of calling the factory and saying, well, look, we need 10 more cars?
No, that was, in those days, that would possibly be the prerogative of the zone manager. But it was a very, very tight allocation system. Didn't always work to the advantage of the customer. It didn't always work to the advantage of the dealer, and sometimes it wasn't to the advantage of the zone office, because if we were being allocated, let's say 76 models, which were the smallest car we made with a 6-cylinder engine, and all of our business at that time was for 8-cylinder cars, then the zone was between a rock and a hard place, and so were the dealers. If we were not getting the cars we needed for the dealers, the dealer himself was going to suffer, because he might have sold 2 76 models, and we could only give him 1 of them for the month. That meant he had a customer that had to wait another whole month to get his car. So it was not a satisfactory system. Being a neophyte at it, at that point in time, I hadn't really formed any opinion about whether it was a good or bad system, but I'd say that I learned very early in distribution that maybe one of your goals was to keep half the people happy. You were probably doing a good job, and it wasn't a good system. But then the Korean War came along, and in November I was drafted and went into the Army for 2 years, and left Oldsmobile at that point, of course, and spent 2 years in the Army as a cartographer doing mapping work. which again was totally unrelated to anything I'd ever done before, but it was interesting. Came back to Oldsmobile after I got out of the Army, and of course I kept in touch with the people that I'd worked with, and Harry Banks, I went to see him when I came out. He at that point was a regional manager, and talked to him about getting back with Oldsmobile, and he said he wanted me back, and there were no openings in the field in the central region at that point in time. So
how many zones were in the central?
There were 5 zones. There was Buffalo, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. And of course, it would have been nice to go back into the Detroit zone because my wife had lived there with her folks while we were in the service, and my mother and dad lived there too, but we weren't going to be fussy about it. I just wanted to get back to work. And Mr. Banks said that in lieu of going right back to work, and there weren't any openings in his region, and he said he'd like to keep me in the region, he wanted me to go to Lansing and go through a training program. And at the time, I didn't see any great benefit in this, but as it turned out, it was a very great benefit because I came to Lansing in January of 1953 and spent 3 months in Lansing going through different departments. Sales budget, distribution, which I already had known something about, but I knew nothing about the other departments, the service department and advertising, merchandising, and just general sales. And the big advantage was that I met a lot of people, some of whom I would only talk to before when I was there in 1950, and other people that I would spend a long time talking with over the phone for many years to come. And it was a big advantage to know who you were talking to and having spent some time with them. So the 3 months that I spent at Lansing were very, very invaluable. In March, Mr. Banks called and said there was an opening in the Cincinnati zone, and would I be interested? And I said yes. So I went back to the job I had before as a senior clerk, but now in the Cincinnati zone. So we moved to Cincinnati at that point in time, and was senior clerk there for about 6 or 8 months. The assistant car distributor, Gene McClure, had spent a lot of time as an assistant car distributor for whatever reason, maybe 5 years, and was getting a little bit upset with lack of progress. And he asked for a leave of absence, and he wanted to go to the West Coast. He and his wife he was from Kentucky, but she was from Florida, and they both worked for an airline in Florida before he'd gone to work for Oldsmobile. They granted him a leave of absence, and he went out to the West Coast. So I took his job as assistant car distributor. At that point in time, Joe Folsom was zone manager in Cincinnati, and Ed Stanley was assistant zone manager, and Stu Nolan had come in as car distributor just before I arrived. He had been a district manager up in Connecticut for maybe 15 or 16, 17 years. And he was not very familiar with distribution, probably had never worked in distribution. So I had a little advantage on him and remembered a little more about it than he did, even though I'd been away from it for a couple of years. So,
how many employees were there average in a zone?
Well, at that point in time, we had a large zone. Cincinnati covered a pretty large area, parts of 7 different states. And
what states were those?
Well, let's see. We had parts of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Illinois. So we had a very large area and was covered by, it was broken down into 7 districts. And we had a district manager, sales, in each one of those districts, headquartered in a town in his area. And the service department at that point in time had, I think, 5 service representatives, so they covered larger territories than the 7 district managers sales did. Then we had in the office, there were of course the zone manager, assistant zone manager. They didn't have business managers at that point in time. They came along a little later. We had a car distributor and always had an assistant car distributor, but in Cincinnati, because of the number of dealers we dealt with, there were 250 or 60 dealers. As compared to the 138 in Detroit. So it was a much larger zone in number of dealers and much larger in the territory covered. So we had also a senior clerk, which I had been when I started down there. And in the office force, we had a zone manager secretary, assistant zone manager secretary. In our case, we had one lady that worked in distribution, and we took the assistant zone manager secretary and used maybe half of her time was used in distribution. We had a lady that worked on for the service manager, and then you normally had one lady who was just maybe a filing clerk or a trainee. So the office force was not extremely large, and there was quite a bit of paperwork that was done in those days because you didn't have, we had a mimeograph, but that was the fastest way of copying anything, and most of the things that were passed around were carbon copies of what was being typed. You didn't have Xerox machines and copying machines, and
So originally a report would be made by hand?
everything was done by hand. We used to dread we'd look on the calendar ahead for a whole year when the General Motors calendar came out. We'd always look ahead and figure the days because you knew you had to sort all the orders and pick the orders from the dealers, and they had to be mailed into Lansing on Friday night. So you looked ahead and saw how many Fridays are you going to have to pull the orders for the week and also do what we call the 10-day report. The 10-day report was to accumulate a form that was mailed in from every dealer every 10 days that told you how many cars he had sold in that 10-day period. And we knew how many cars we had shipped to the dealer. And we knew how many cars he had in stock from the previous report that we had balanced out with. So you added what he had in stock the previous time by model and series, added in what we had shipped to the dealer. Then we took the dealer's report of what he sold, and deductively you ended up with what he had in stock at the end of that 10 days. And it was a rather complicated hand operation to balance it all out, given two things. That we had a lot of dealers who didn't have very great memories and went back even 10 days to remember whether he had received a car. Some of them were not great at addition and subtraction, so we couldn't take their paper report at face value. We had to double check every one of them. This was 250 or 60 of them. And we'd put in our shipments, and if the dealer didn't show that he had received a car, we had to calculate back and say, well, is he just not remembering it, or did we ship the car and because of the trucking time it hadn't arrived there yet? So there was a little bit of a blank area in there, Never Never Land, that we called in transit is what we called it. Yeah, and you had to assume it was in transit. Well, if it went on for 2 10-day periods and he said he hadn't received a car, then we knew he just forgotten about it. And sometimes the district manager, as he was making a contact with the dealer, we'd tell the district manager by mail and say, when next time you're in there, would you find out whatever happened to this car? Well, the dealer had sold it and forgot to tell us about it. Well, by that time, we probably had assumed he had sold it also. Except we didn't have the owner's name and address, which he had to send us written.
So the zones kept track of that?
We had to keep track of all of it.
Well, what about used cars?
Used cars at that time were of importance, obviously, to the dealer because a lot of his money was tied up in used cars. They were important to us only secondarily. If a dealer had too many used cars and he had all his money tied up in used cars, we knew that he was going to be in financial trouble. So it behooved Oldsmobile to keep track of his used car operation, but only as a secondary type of interest. We weren't directly interested. We didn't have to worry about how many he had and how many he sold and how many he had at the end and try to balance anything. It was, we took his word for the used car operation because we had no way of knowing whether it was right or wrong.
What day's supply of...
Well, that depended on where you were. We had a report that Mr. Banks had sent out to all the zones in the region. It was a 3x3 used car report, or 30-day used car report. The normal rule of thumb was that if you've had a used car more than 30 days, the dealer was going to start losing money on it. So the district manager would normally, on a contact at the dealership, go out and review his used cars. Sometimes you could look out the window and tell he was in trouble because all the cars had cobwebs inside and all 4 tires were flat or something like that. Oh, there were some horrendous cases of dealers who had used cars forever and just they went out in the back into scrap finally. But that was one thing that the district manager could do that was a benefit to the dealer, and sometimes the dealer didn't realize that what he was trying to do, to rub the dealer's nose into the used car end of the business. Dealers normally are so enraptured by the new car end of the business, they forget about used cars, they'd forget about the service operation. It was kind of, that's all that takes place at the back end of the business. It's out of sight, out of mind, don't worry about it. But the best dealers over the years I've found out is the best dealers were those that knew used cars and kept track of used cars and made sure that if they didn't sell within a certain period of time, they took them to the auction and got rid of them, and take your loss today and not worry about it. But
actually, then the dealer operated as an independent.
oh, absolutely independent, absolutely. And there was no direct contact or no contractual relationship other than the sales and service agreement that the dealer renewed at that time every year with Oldsmobile, with General Motors. And it was not tremendously binding on the part of the dealer. It was more binding on the part of General Motors by far.
You're talking about the dealer agreement?
The sales, yeah, the selling agreement.
So would you say that the dealer's responsibility is less than the factory?
Oh, by far, by far. He could hold us responsible for not furnishing him product, and he could hold us responsible for not honoring the warranty for his customers, and he could hold us responsible for providing him with the product and training and a lot of things like that. But when it came right down to it, our side of the agreement, we could not tell him who or to whom he could sell a car, or when he could sell a car, or how much he could sell it for. Now the government, of course, obviously right after the war there were some price, the OPA still had some prices in effect. By the time I started with General Motors, those had gone out the window. But so there was no hard and fast rule, and not much of a club that we could use, so to speak, on a dealer to even get him to service a customer's car. It had to be cajoling and wheedling to get him to do some things. We didn't have a lot of legal stand behind us. Mostly it was a good faith agreement, and in 99% of the time it worked. The dealer didn't want to irritate us for very obvious reasons, and maybe because he figured, well, if he got us too mad, we wouldn't ship him any more cars, and even if he had a contract that said he was to receive product. It didn't say how many product. So we probably used distribution in many respects as the club or the carrot or the stick to get what we wanted done. And it was usually for the good of the dealer or the customer that we wanted to get something done. I've seen it done many times that you had to come right out and lay it on the table with a dealer and just tell him, if you don't take care of your customer and get these cars serviced, or you don't do something else like clean up your place. Maybe sometimes it was just getting a dealer to clean up his place of business, or put up a sign, or do something like that.
He had to buy his own signs.
Oh, he had to buy his own signs in those days from Oldsmobile. We had the 6-foot service disc was one of the famous ones that the dealer should put up something, and it was amazing how many dealers that didn't really understand that. And of course, down in Kentucky and West Virginia and parts of Virginia that we contacted out of Cincinnati, there were some dealerships that were not much more than just a garage with a hole cut in the floor. They didn't even have a lift in there. You serviced the car, the man walked down a flight of stairs that were cut into the dirt and serviced the car from underneath. And they didn't really think they had to have a sign. In some cases, there were so many signs on the dealership already. He sold John Deere implements, and he sold some kind of bottled heating gas, and he might have even been a gas station. And then to put another sign up there for Oldsmobile, he said, well, everybody knows who I am. I've been here my dad was here before me. Why should I put up a sign? So there were a lot of things that in those days were done on a different basis, obviously, than they are today, where you have a sign that is leased to the dealer, and they're all identical all across the country. They're leased, and they're maintained by the company that put them up. They are all standardized. They all look very nice. They're at the same height, and you can see them from quite a ways away. We had one dealer down in West Virginia. I can't remember the name of the town right now, but we always tried to keep the zone manager from going down there because we had a dealer who had been in business for many years, and the only sign on the dealership was the 6-foot service disc that was nailed to a big oak tree. Now, the reason it had to be nailed to the oak tree was that there was no dealership. The dealership was the man's home, and he serviced his cars in the garage at the back of the house. But if he went out of business, there would have been no dealer. And it was such a small town that there wouldn't have been anybody ever go into the business. So Larry Humphreys, who was the district manager down in that area, always lived in fear that somebody was going to show up from that was not quite attuned to that area, like our zone manager sitting in Cincinnati would come down the road and see this and decide that we ought to terminate the dealer. Well, that would just lose us some business and would gain us nothing. But those were odd circumstances.
Well, they're interesting.
Yes.
How do you determine where to place the dealer then?
Well, at that point in time, it had not been done scientifically. In the 1930s, and you know, talking to people like Harry Banks and Joe Folsom, who was a zone manager there and had been there in the Cincinnati area for probably well over 20-some years in different jobs, talking to those people, I learned a lot about how business was done before I arrived, and of course I've seen how it's been done in the time that I've worked since then. But district managers at that time were given, their main job in the 30s was to go out and find more dealers, because the theory at that time was the more dealers you have, the more cars you will sell. The only restraint placed on them, obviously, was we don't want to have two dealers in the same town. But there wasn't much worry about how close is the town to the next town. Nobody really worried about that on a scientific basis. So the district manager was really interested in getting more dealers. I contacted the dealer in, well, Olive Hill, Kentucky was one, and Vanceburg, Kentucky was another. And both of the gentlemen told me, when I kind of introduced myself, I was the district manager at this time, working out of Ironton, Ohio. They said that the reason they became dealers, somebody from Oldsmobile, couldn't even remember the man's name, obviously he must have been a district manager of ours, sometime in the 30s, came by there with a nice-looking Oldsmobile and stopped to buy gasoline. They admired the car as they were pumping the gas, and they said, boy, what would a car like that run? And he said, why don't you become a dealer and you can buy it at wholesale? And they both became dealers. And that's how we started some of the dealerships down in that area. And there weren't the surveys that are done nowadays to determine what is the population of the town, look at the RL Polk registrations and how many cars can be expected to be sold in that territory surrounding this town. And if Oldsmobile is supposed to get whatever percent it is, maybe at that point in time it would have been 5% of the market. So if you take 5% of the cars registered, and average registrations for a year in the, let's say, let's call it Olive Hill, Kentucky. If there were 100 cars sold average in the year or registered in that county, and Oldsmobile normally gets 5% of the business, then you would assume that if we signed up Buddy Rayburn as a dealer, we would expect him to sell 5 cars a year. Well, could a man exist on 5 cars a year? Normally, the answer would be no. But I don't think they worried about that much in the 1930s, or even maybe even after World War II. We did a little of that, and thinking, well, if he thinks he can make a living on 5 cars a year, and he's now making a living running a gas station in a garage, then the 5 cars he sells would be pure profit because he's already paying his overhead. So get out the papers and sign him up.
Now, was there any financial investment by the so-called?
Yes, the dealer would have to, he would normally be expected to put some parts in. And the district manager probably had a parts schematic that said you normally would need to stock so many kinds of parts. And there was a planning guide, as I recall, that said if you're going to sell from 1 to 10 cars a year, you should have these minimum numbers of parts. And it was all laid out by somebody in Lansing in the parts department and said you need so many shock absorbers, and then if you go up to the larger dealer, he's going to sell 100 to 200 cars a year, he probably should stock 1 rear end and an axle and some other larger parts that would take longer to get from a warehouse. So there was a guide, and then every year when the car came out, the new model came out, there would be some changes between that model and the previous model, and you might require some what they called special tools, essential tools, because if we changed the car so that there was a part on that car that couldn't be taken off with an open-ended wrench and it needed a special tool of some kind to repair, then every year those essential tools would be sold to the dealer because he would need those tools to service the new model car. Those were not normally a large investment, as I recall. Most of the time it was a $50, $60, $70 type of investment for some kind of wrenches or a special set of something. One of the larger ones that I can remember going forward in time was when we came out 1965 in the fall with a 1966 Toronado front-wheel drive. Well, now you're getting into a whole new ballgame with front-wheel drive, and the essential tool package, as I recall, was several $100s. And some dealers would balk at that. You take a dealer who still only sold 5 cars a year up in the northern reaches of North Dakota or something and said, I don't even know if I'm going to sell a Toronado. Why do I have to buy $500 worth of tools? Well, then you get into a little bit of an argument back and forth about, yes, but somebody coming through there with a Toronado, even if you didn't sell it and he has a breakdown, how are you going to service that man's car? So normally the dealer would break down and buy the tools, because those tools would be used for the next year, and the next year, and the next year. Anytime you had a Toronado, you can assume that probably for 4 or 5 years they weren't going to change the type of tool that you would need. So it was a little bit of a selling proposition and a little bit of a maybe a threat from time to time that you know, you've got to have the tools. We can't afford to have some Oldsmobile customer break down in your town and you can't fix his car. It would embarrass you, but it would destroy us as a company if we can't provide service at every location. So those are the types of things.
Those tools, you ordered them directly from the factory then? Okay.
Yeah, the essential tools were designed by the Oldsmobile engineers or General Motors engineers, and were sold through our parts and accessories department. And the service department obviously were involved, and they were sold to the dealer directly by General Motors, and they were made by a company, let's say Kent Moore, or some of the companies that are well known in that end of the business. We did a lot of business with Kent Moore. I think they're out of Kalamazoo or Battle Creek or something. And they, at our behest, they designed the tool or took our design and manufactured the tool, and then they sold them to the dealers. But normally we made sure the dealer bought the tools and they were billed through his parts account. Anything that was sent to the dealer in the way of parts or accessories were billed to the dealer monthly on the parts account. And then the dealer sent us a check for his parts account at the end of the month. And that was another job the district manager had, and sometimes even the car distributor. I should have mentioned the car distributors in the zone was also the office manager. So it was you wore 2 hats. You spent all your time trying to do the distribution and the 10-day reports, and then whatever time there was left, which was usually 0, you were an office manager, and you were supposed to handle all the little petty fights in the office and make sure that that all the ladies were happy with what they were doing and whom they were working for, and the typing was getting out on time, and all the stenography was being done. And then you had the last thing you did was find out that you got a call from Lansing that 5 dealers had not paid their parts account last month. Well, that's all you needed. So you had to get a hold of the district manager and first you called the dealer and asked him if he'd sent the check. Oh yes, he'd always sent it. It's in the mail. Then the district manager probably would have to end up going out there and getting the money. And sometimes the dealer, we found dealers that had gone out of business and we hadn't even known it. And then you had a little bit of a problem because the dealer had closed his doors, gone to other climes, and he owed us a couple $100s on a parts bill. The only saving grace there was that we held back. Every time we shipped a car to the dealer, we put some money into a holdback account. Half of 1% of the invoice of the car was put in a holdback account. We owed that to the dealer, but we paid it to him at the end of the year. If the dealer, meantime, had done something or hadn't paid an account or something, we deducted that out before we sent him his final check. So that was about the only thing we had as a protection against dealers not paying their bills. Cars that were shipped to the dealer were handled by GMAC on a floor plan, so we didn't have to worry about collecting for cars except for those dealers who were so shaky that the General Motors Acceptance Corporation would not, under any circumstances, handle their cars. Then we had the little problem of the dealer would send us an order, and we would send it on into Lansing, and we would have the car built and then shipped to our warehouse. And the dealer had to come into Cincinnati to pick it up at the warehouse, and to get it out of the warehouse, he had to give us a certified check for the amount. And there were a few times that some of those got a little hairy, where the dealer came in at lunch hour, maybe unintentionally and maybe intentionally, and the release was laying on the table, and maybe we had a young lady working for us that hadn't been there too long, and he said, "Oh, I'm so-and-so from Horse Cave, Kentucky." And she said, "Oh, this is your release," and handed it to him, and neglected to get the check, or we'd neglected to tell her, "Don't give that man the check," and off he, the release, and then off he went with our car, and some of those resulted in, well, there were a few that resulted in the loss of a complete car. Well, people who had that done to them as office manager car distributors never lived it down. It wasn't going to break General Motors or Oldsmobile, but that's one thing you didn't want hanging over your head forever, was that, oh, so-and-so, he let a car get out of the warehouse without the funds. That was not a happy situation. Luckily, it never happened to me, but it did happen to some people I knew. I was a district manager after I'd been assistant car distributor for a while. I went out, in 1954, I went out as a district manager working the southern Ohio and northern Kentucky area. And I should have been living probably in Chillicothe, Ohio, but unfortunately the Piketon atomic energy plant was being built at Piketon, which was about halfway between Chillicothe and Portsmouth, Ohio. And they had so many workers in that area working on the plant, it was impossible to find anything to rent. So I worked out of Cincinnati and drove out into the territory every Monday and came back on Friday. And
You had a company car?
I had a company car, yes, and they furnished the car and the gasoline and the upkeep and the maintenance, and we drove them 5,000 miles and then turned the car in and took another one out. Finally did find a house to rent in Ironton, Ohio, so my wife and I moved down to Ironton, Ohio. The only claim to fame that Ironton had is that it was the tail end of Henry Ford's old Detroit-Toledo Ironton Railroad, the DTI. And I could see why Ironton was the end of the railroad, because once you got there, you wanted to leave and go back again. It really was not exciting. We were there for about 7 months, and then I was transferred to a larger district in Louisville, Kentucky. Was there for 3 months, and in that time, our district manager in Indianapolis had quit and gone off to do something else. So I was trying to handle the Louisville district, which went all the way down to the Tennessee line and went up about halfway between Evansville and Indianapolis. So I had a fairly good-sized territory of about 37 dealers to contact, and then they asked me to do some of Indianapolis because they lost the district manager. Indianapolis at that time was not a zone. It was under Cincinnati. So that was our District 7. I was working 6 and covering parts of 7. And this was early 1956. Living in Louisville, and then I got a call from Harry Banks, and regional manager, and he said they're going to open an Indianapolis zone, and he said they're thinking that they would like you to be up there as office manager car distributor, which would be a promotion. So I said, fine, I'd love it. Well, Newt Barber came in. He was assistant general sales manager for the East, and I met him at the airport in Indianapolis in March of 1956. And he said, we want to get over to the offices we've rented. And he said, they've already made the arrangements on the space, but you and I have to get with a phone company and decide what phones we want and all that. We want to get this going in a big hurry. So we spent about 2 days and looking over the space and then deciding on what kind of phones we needed, and they wanted to get this thing going. So then George Carr, GHP Carr, was going to be zone manager, and he showed up the next afternoon. Webb Hoffman was going to be assistant zone manager, and Bob Schoen was going to be Bob Schoen was going to be a business management manager. And the brand new zone, yeah, and we'd had some business managers starting probably in '55. So he was coming in from Houston to be, he'd been district manager in Houston. So we all got together and we were having dinner that night, and Harry Banks had come over, even though it wasn't going to be in his region anymore. It currently was, so he came over, and we were all sitting at the table having dinner, and Mr. Barber was paged. And he came back from the phone, and he said, just talked to Vic Sutherland, who was a general sales manager, and he said they've decided for some reason or other they're not going to open this zone after all, and everybody just got up and took off in all kinds of directions. Well, that left me in a little bit of a lurch because Mr. Barber had insisted that I get located really fast, so I'd gone out and bought a house. And suddenly I wasn't going to have that job, and it wasn't even going to be there. So I was really in trouble, and immediately called my wife, who was trying to get furniture arranged in Louisville, to move to Indianapolis. And I said, no, we're not going to go there after all. And so her mother was ill up in Detroit, so she went on up to Detroit while I kind of hassled around with the problem in Indianapolis. Worked in, and then they decided that I should stay in Indianapolis as district manager, move from Louisville to Indianapolis. That would eliminate my problem with the house. So I started working in Indianapolis, and about 10 days went by, and I got a call from Harry Banks again, and he said, Stu Nolan, or Tom Shavacco was assistant zone manager in Cincinnati. E.F. McDonald was the zone manager, but Shavacco was assistant zone manager. And they decided they were going to send Shavacco out as a zone manager in Denver. So Stu Nolan, who was car distributor, office manager, car distributor, was going to move up to assistant zone manager, and Harry Banks said, I'd like to have you come in as car distributor. And he said that would make everything kind of nice because that's the job you were going to have in Indianapolis, and I'd like to have you. And I said, well, I'd love to come in there. He said, the only problem is, and in this days we didn't have any Argonaut Realty to bail you out of houses or anything like that. He said, can you get out of your house deal? So I said, well, let me find out. So I hung up the phone, and I called the realty people, and I caught one of them at the office, and they said, I don't think you can get out of it. I put $500 down as earnest money. He said, I don't think there's any way we can get out of the house deal because this house had been on the market for a while. And he said, you know, we signed all the papers. And I said, well, okay. So I sat around for about 10 minutes, and then I started to do a little computing in my head and figured, well, I'll probably get a $50 raise a month. In 10 months, I'll have the $500 back, and I won't be sitting in Indianapolis. I'll already have a better job in Cincinnati, be back and I'll be in where I want to be. So I called Harry Banks back and said, no problem. I didn't lie to him. I just said, no problem. And he said, great, be in Cincinnati tomorrow morning. So I got in the car, called my wife, and said, we're going to Cincinnati, back to Cincinnati instead of in Indianapolis. And she said, what about the house deal? I said, talk to you about it later. And we took off for Cincinnati. And I was car distributor in Cincinnati then from April of 1956. And then Harry Banks called me just right after Christmas in 1956. And he said that Bob Berger, who was office manager car distributor in Detroit, was going to be moved up to assistant zone manager in Detroit because of some other moves, and would I like to be office manager car distributor in Detroit? Well, I was thrilled. It was a far bigger zone in a regional city. My folks were still there, and Nancy's folks were still in Detroit, so I said yes. And so in January of '57, I moved into Detroit as office manager car distributor and worked there until November of 1963. About 7 years. In November of '63, I was promoted and transferred to assistant zone manager in Omaha. I worked there for 4 years, and in 1968, I was transferred to Kansas City as assistant zone manager. Worked there for a little over a year, about 15 months. And in February of 1969, was transferred into Lansing as a distribution coordinator. My job at that time was to travel the eastern half of the United States and contact our zone offices. There were 13 of them. And just kind of review our distribution practices, which had changed greatly over the years. And
to make,
well, we got away from that Sloan distribution process that tied a dealer to some number that was computed out of some old data that had nothing to do with today's business, and had gotten on to a more normal distribution system, and it was called the computerized distribution system. It was actually devised by Tom Shavacco and Gordy Osborne, who were the director and assistant director of distribution, sales analysis and distribution in Lansing. And they had devised a system that took the dealer's most current 30-day sales. And, well, I'm sorry, they took the zone first. They said, all right, let's take the Cincinnati zone as an example. The Cincinnati zone, in the last 30 days of sales, a running 30-day sales, three 10-day periods. And let's relate those sales to the national sales. In Cincinnati, let's say it was 6.12% of the national sales. So, and they did this by car line. At this time, we had more than just 76s, 78s, and 98s. We had what we called the F-85, which later became the Cutlass. And you had 88s, and you had 98s, and you had Toronados. And you related each of those percents. A zone could be 6.12% of F-85 or Cutlass sales. Cutlass, I guess, by 1969. And they could be 5.5% of 88s, and they could be 8% of 98s. And every one of those was completely separate. So you knew what your production was going to be for the next month, fairly well. And you took that production for the next month, and you said, all right, if we're going to build, I don't know, 10,000 F-85 or Cutlasses, and Cincinnati 6.12% or something, then Cincinnati zone obviously should have 610 or 6,100, whatever the number was, allotted to them for the next month's production. So you ran that figure out, and you generated a number for the Cincinnati zone. Well, then the next step was the dealer preference guide. That took the number you just established earlier that evening, because it was all done overnight. Computers finally came along. You couldn't do this by hand. There's no way you could do it by hand. And you said, all right, every dealer in the Cincinnati zone had some share in selling that 6.12% of the national sales. But we just determined that he is a part of the zone, and you can't break him away from the zone. So the dealer is some portion of that 610, let's say, Cutlasses. So you took his 30-day sales, and you developed another percent. A large dealer might be 10% of the whole zone. In the case of Columbia Oldsmobile in Cincinnati, a very large dealer, 10% of the zone. So you looked at that 6.12%, and it came up to 600 cars, let's say. So you said, all right, Columbia Old should get 60. They should get 10% of those cars over the next month. So your job then was to start preferencing cars, or pulling orders off the dealer's preference list and selecting those orders on the basis that he was going to get 60 of those cars. But the next 10-day period, you recomputed all those figures, and Columbia Olds was no longer the 10% dealer. He dropped to 8%, which meant you had been preferencing faster rate than he should, or another dealer had gone up in percent, and so you were always changing it. Every 10 days your numbers changed, so it was a constant ongoing. I used to kind of liken it to a perpetual inventory at a supermarket. If you normally sell 3 cases of peaches in a supermarket, and this has been your history forever, then you should normally assume that in the pipeline coming to that supermarket, you should have enough peaches in cases that you could support selling 3 cases of peaches every week. And that's what we were trying to do with automobiles. A little more complicated because you had the different car lines to work with. But again, unless you had a perpetual inventory system, you were always locking a dealer into some number that didn't mean anything anymore. It was old news. You had to be as current as you could be, and that was the one feature that the computerized preference had. It was adopted by all the other divisions overall, even though it was invented at Oldsmobile. All the divisions ended up using it, with a possible exception of Cadillac. I don't think Cadillac ever understood how they distributed a car. I'm not sure they even do today. Their volume was always at a lesser number, and they didn't worry about it as much. Chevrolet, with a huge volume, the computerized preference did great things for them, and it worked very good for Pontiac and Buick. The number that we later started on the dealer preference guide, the number we were really shooting at on both the preference guide, I guess, and the zone computerized, was trying to develop a number that said this is, we call it a cum earned. In other words, we took that 30-day sales and we ran it against a total availability number. This is a better way to put it. If you took that next month's production that we were trying to allocate by zone and then by dealer, and you added that to the number of cars already in stock in that zone or in that dealership, that gave you what we called a total availability. So we took that large number and multiplied that by the zone or the dealer's percent and said at the end of the next month, the total cars available should be this number, and then deduct what they already had. Then you had the perpetual inventory going. And that solved the one big huge problem of Are we preferencing too fast against this dealer as his sales dip and soar? How do you keep in contact with him? You might be over-preferencing or under-preferencing, over-scheduling, under-scheduling. If you threw it against that number, which was the cars to be built, plus what already were there, and threw that number against the total availability, that told you what you should have out there as available, and then that caused less fluctuation week to week, and it smoothed out this whole system. There were some other little things that were done in there, but we had a seasonal factor in there that we had to have for places like Buffalo. When the snow starts in the Buffalo zone, in the Buffalo area, sales stop because they just get inundated in sales. But if you took their 30-day sales and you waited until April, well, the snow finally melts and they start doing some business, really you're kind of late because you wait until the sales start and sales start to boom in Buffalo. How do you ever catch up with them? You're into the next winter before you ever made up for what has happened. So they had a seasonal factor that they would crank in and say, when you start developing the March figures in Buffalo, you should apply a factor of 1.18%. In other words, whatever you develop, make it 1800ths greater than that to try to anticipate that spring, because based on past history, the spring starts there at such and such a point in time. So you had a seasonal factor. As their sales go up, the sales in Florida, as the snowbirds leave, their sales normally fall off a little bit. So Buffalo goes up and Florida goes down. The Jacksonville zone would fall off. So it was a good system. We later refined it when I moved up from coordinator in the field to assistant director of sales analysis and distribution, working for Gordy Osborne.
Now that would be out of Lansing.
In Lansing here, and that was 1974. And then I replaced Gordy in 1980 as director of sales analysis and distribution. And the one thing I'd always had in the back of my mind, I guess for years, and he and I never agreed on it, was that why should a dealer become a percent of the zone? Isn't that an artificial way to treat the dealer as far as his real involvement with Oldsmobile? And everybody agreed, yes, it is artificial. But when it came to distribution, nobody could ever agree, well, how could you do this? We broke down all of our allocations to dealers based on a zone number, and then you took the dealer as a percent of that zone. And in talking to some large dealers around the country, Henry Faulkner, for instance, in Philadelphia, on a couple of different trips that we had been on with Henry as award trips for sales and stuff. My wife and I would go along as host and hostess. And I'd mentioned to Henry one time that I really thought that it was unfair to treat Faulkner Oldsmobile as a percent of the Philadelphia zone. And he said, you know, he said, I've had the same feeling myself sometimes. I've sensed that we were not getting enough cars in the Philadelphia zone. And when I complained about it, I found out that my compatriots there in Philadelphia, the Feinsteins and the dealers in Upper Darby and around the area were not selling cars nearly as well as I was. But unless they sold cars at the same rate I was, the pie that the Philadelphia zone earned was going to be smaller. And regardless of how big I became, I would only get a slice of the smaller pie. So he said, I know exactly what you're talking about. So we revamped the distribution system, and we made every dealer in the United States a percent of the United States instead of a percent of the zone. So every dealer lived on his own. He didn't have to worry about what was going on with his neighboring dealers or anybody else. He was a percent of the United States. All he had to worry about was his relationship in sales to the total Oldsmobile sales in the United States. And we put that, finally, we had a lot of problems trying to get that programmed for computers, dealing with very large numbers, and in some cases taking it out to 6 or 7 decimal places because the dealer couldn't, well, it's Columbia Olds. If we said he was 10% of the Cincinnati zone, all of a sudden he's less than 1% of the United States. You're dealing with numbers that are much smaller or much larger in decimals. But we finally got that put in and operating probably about 1984, and they're still using it to this day. It has worked very well, and the dealers who really understand the system think it is marvelous. We've had many inquiries from other divisions, Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Buick were studying the system. When I retired in '87, they had not totally adopted it, but they were talking about taking it over. it was expensive for us to put in. It would be much less expensive for them because they could take our programming and just adapt it without a great deal of expense in the programming expense. I don't know how many thousands of dollars it cost, but to me, I thought it was well worth it. That if we talk about a dealer being tied directly to Oldsmobile, then why did we have to have him suffer, or sometimes, mostly it was suffer as a percent of the zone? And it's worked well. But that was one thing I got done before I retired. Very happy to have gotten it done, because I thought it was something that would really needed to be done a long time before.
Tom, you worked with a lot of people.
Oh yes, yeah.
Larry Banks.
Yeah, mm-hmm, yep.
Who you worked with?
Well, when I first worked for him in Detroit in 1950, when Bob and I were the gophers and the grunts, so to speak, in the zone office, I had to go out and buy a 4-color Nova pencil. I don't know whether you remember those. They were a silver-barreled pencil, and on the side it had a slide on all 4 sides. And one wrote in red, green, blue, and black. Because I had to keep separate reports, and I'm trying to think what it was that Mr. Banks wanted on certain dealers. And I had to do them in 4 colors. And one thing I might mention, at that point in time, I stopped writing and started printing, because I was never a great penman anyway, and Mr. Banks couldn't read my writing. Nobody could read my writing. My own notes in college I couldn't read half the time, so I started printing. And he thought that was great, and so did I, because I didn't have any more problems. But I had to do these reports in 4 different colors. I bought one of these Nova pencils. I think I still got it somewhere. And well, I'm trying to think exactly what they were. We had what we called a zone check sheet, which had all the dealers listed by town within the 7 districts that we had, and I had to keep track of something on all those dealers for Mr. Banks. And I really can't remember what it was, except that it had to be done in 4 colors.
Each operation of
It had
responsibility of different colors.
Yeah, well, it had something to do, and I took those numbers off the 10-day reports as they came in from the dealers. He was interested in something that he was having me track. I don't even remember what it was. Now, it was kind of a mechanical thing that I did, and at that time it didn't. At that time it didn't. Whoops! It pulled right out there, didn't we? Or is that the microphone?
No, we're all set.
Yeah. I would say Mr. Banks was very easy to work for. He never got mad at anybody. That was handled by Mr. Ruth, who had a terrible temper. But Harry was very easy to work for, and I think if he found somebody that he thought was working very hard and was really applying himself to the job, I think he took care of them forever. He certainly took care of Bob Berger, who retired as the vice president of General Motors, and I can't say that he didn't take care of me. I got out of phase with 2 years in the Army, but I had no complaints about it. I don't know that I ever wanted to be a vice president anyway. You had to give up too much of your life. I still have too much of a private life that I enjoy to want to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. We worked enough in distribution, and I had enough of it in the early years of not being home at night for days on end, doing the 10-day reports and that type of thing. But Harry always took care of those people that he thought were working for him.
You mentioned Ed Ruth.
Oh, Ed Ruth he'd been in the Navy, and I remember when I first went to work for Olds, and Bob Berger said about the second day I was there, and he said, now, Saturday morning we got to come down to here. I said, I thought I'd finally found a job where I only had to work 5 days a week, and coming off the floor I'd been working 6.
Is this in Detroit?
This was in Detroit in the zone office, and Ed Ruth was the assistant zone manager. And I said to Bob, what are we going to do on Saturday? He said, we're going to clean the stock room. And I said, clean the stock room? Yes. So I went down when we got there Saturday morning, I went down to the janitor station on the floor, and I got a mop and some water, and I mopped the floors down. Bob dusted all the shelves and everything, because Monday morning, Mr. Ruth came in, almost like a white glove inspection in the Navy, running his finger along the shelves in the stock room before he came into the office. And he came in, smiled, and went through on the way through. And being in the General Motors building, you didn't have an office that was enclosed by itself. You had a common corridor in the building, so people would pop in and out of parts of your office just public from the outside. You had no way to screen it. You couldn't get the area cordoned off at the end. It was and across the street from us, or across the aisle, I should say, common aisleway, was the Cleveland Graphite and Brass Company. And we had another office that was beyond them, so they sat kind of in the middle of part of our little enclave there, which was not a very good arrangement, but it lasted for years, and I guess we put up with it. But Ed Ruth would walk through our office, so to speak, to get to his own, because it was just through another little door. But I at times when he would find, he'd go back into the stockroom in the middle of the day, and one of the young ladies had been back there to get some paper off a shelf, and instead of taking the paper out of the brown wrapper that it was in, 100 sheets of Hammermill bond or whatever it was, she'd tear off the front and pull out some sheets, and the brown part of the paper would be hanging down over the front of the shelf, and he would just absolutely go into a fit about how messy that looked. Well, he never said anything to the young ladies. It was Bob and I that caught the brunt of this. So I'd go back there with a knife and trim off the edges and everything, and I thought at the time, boy, I said, he's really got a temper. And I guess over the years, he didn't get any better. He really would get very violent at times. He was so particular about things. I delivered a car to him one time. The car distributor had ordered a 98 for him, green, which was his favorite color. It was serviced down at Cadillac Cass, which was our local dealer just below the General Motors building. It was a Cadillac distributorship and an Oldsmobile dealership, a dual. And we had our cars sent in there from Lansing and then had them serviced. And I was the gopher, so I had to go down and get the car, take it over to the Fisher garage, and then take Mr. Ruth's old car back down to the dealership. So I took the car up there, and I was sitting there, and it was a little after quitting time. Bob and I were still working, and Ray Corey, the car distributor, was still there. We normally didn't get out of there when the place closed. We had some things to wrap up. And Ed Ruth had left, and the next thing you know, the door flew open, and Ed Ruth was there, and he looked like one of the robots out of a Star Wars. His eyes were just gleaming, and he was pinning our car distributor to the wall, and he's saying, "I don't ever want you to give me I told you before, I'm not going to drive a car without vent shades." And the car distributor looked up and said to me, "Didn't that car have vent shades?" And I said, "No, I guess it didn't." The little chrome vent shades that were at the top of the windows where you could roll down the windows a little bit and get some air without rain coming in. And it turned out that the car distributor had ordered the car and forgot the vent shades, and so I had to go back down to the dealership, get the old car, take it back over to the Fisher garage, and take the new car back down there until we get vent shades installed on it. So he was a very fussy individual. And yet I got along very well with him. I did reports for him and things like that, and managed to generally not screw anything up. So I never caught his wrath, and neither did Bob Berger. But Ray Corey, as car distributor, always seemed to be catching a lot of hell from Ed Ruth. And I guess truth be known, he didn't really work too hard, and he had a lot of things going on the side, a lot of romances. He wasn't married, and he always had something going on with some girl in the building, and that got he'd forget what he was supposed to be doing, and Ed Ruth would have a good opportunity to pin him to the wall again. Our district managers at that time were kind of an interesting lot, and we had two district managers in the city of Detroit, one east side and one west side. And a fellow that I really liked and learned a lot from, because he spent time with me telling me a little more about the business that when I had some time, that was Bob Teeter, a lovely individual. And on the other side of the in what we call District 5. Now that was the main district, or the main parts of that district were Flint and Lansing. District 4 was Webb Hoffman. I worked out of Grand Rapids. And District 5 was worked out of Fort Wayne. Bob, he later came into Lansing and worked in distribution, and then he bought that golf course out in no. Bob Hill? Well, I think it was Hill, Bob Hill. Yeah. And then District 6 was out of Toledo, and that was Don Cooper. So those fellows, I I really didn't have a lot of dealings with them. When they called in about distribution, they normally talked to the car distributor, Ray Corey. But then a strange thing happened, which really helped me quite a bit, and that was that Ray Corey thought he didn't want to handle all these calls anymore. It was interfering with his personal life, I think. And Bob and I didn't really think too much of Ray Corey, as you might have assumed. But so he decided he would take care of the distribution for the city, districts 1 and 2 in the city, and that Bob and I could take care of all the outlying area, the Indiana, parts of Indiana, Ohio, and all of the rest of Michigan. And so that was fine because it gave Bob and I a lot of training, and we ended up talking to dealers on the phone, talking to the district managers, and it really got us involved in the guts of the business in the distribution sense. And it was great training. So we did that, and then of course when I got drafted in the Army and went away for a couple of years. But when I came back and went to Cincinnati and went back into the same job, I knew an awful lot about distribution that I would not have known had I just been the third step clerk and never handled the phone and never handled the dealers and had never talked to dealers on the phone. So when I got down to Cincinnati, I fell into it very easily. And our friend Stu Nolan, who was a car distributor coming out of the New England area, had quite a New England accent and a Jersey accent, a bottle and a total. And the dealers would call from somewhere down in Kentucky. They could not understand him, and he could not understand them, so I ended up doing the phone business, which, again, was a great aid to my training. And I ended up talking, and Stu Nolan really kind of took over as office manager and dumped the car distribution onto me. So it worked out fine. It gave me a lot of good training early. And I had to make decisions and, live or die with them. And I learned early on that the one basic thing that you have to remember in distribution is if you ever promise something to a dealer, in this case being a car, you must do it. You must never tell a dealer, I'll get that car for you in the order into the factory next week, and then not do it. I don't care what it takes, you've got to do what you promised to do. And that's all I've ever done all the time I worked for Oldsmobile. If you tell somebody you're going to do it, you do it. And I learned that from Harry Banks in a way. We used to carp sometimes about, he had some favored dealers that didn't always make us very happy. Sometimes the dealers that he took the best care of were not our best dealers, but they were flatterers. And I won't mention any names, you probably don't want to hear names, but there was one of them that was very bad, and he always wanted to tell you exactly what he thought you wanted to hear. And Harry Banks thought he was a great guy. And even till today, Harry's gone, of course, but this fellow's still alive, the dealer, and I did talk to him maybe a couple of years ago, even after I retired. He called one day, and he goes to Florida now, and his kids run the business, but he's always been that kind of a guy that, hey, how are you? It's great to see you. You look great, blah, blah, but as a dealer, he really wasn't much. That was the only thing I would ever carp about with Harry Banks, was that he was taken in by some of those people that pretended to be his friends, and they really weren't his friends.
Do you ever remember having to cancel a dealer?
Terminate a dealer? Oh, yes. Not in those early days, but when I was in as assistant zone manager, yeah, we had to terminate dealers sometimes.
What conditions would...
Well, one I mentioned earlier was dealers would just lock up and go away. Well, that's if a dealer locked his doors and didn't do business for 30 days, he was automatically terminated. Now, we would be very sure that he wasn't there for 30 days, and maybe we'd let 60 days expire so that we were absolutely right. And then we would send a registered letter and all these kinds of things. You haven't had your business in operation for 30 days, you are no longer an Oldsmobile dealer, and then we'd terminate the franchise. We went through kind of a funny one. Bob Berger and I ended up having to go up to Grand Rapids in a lawsuit that developed at a dealership in Hastings, Michigan, Harwood Dewey. And I was car distributor, and Bob had been car distributor, as I'd mentioned, just before I came to Detroit. So he was involved in the thing because he had been the car distributor. He was now assistant zone manager. And we had to take the train up a couple times to Grand Rapids because that's where the trial was going to be. Well, we had to go up for depositions with the lawyers. And Harwood and Dewey were partners in a dealership. And this is one of the strange things that you can develop in the dealerships. Dewey had all the automobile experience that anybody could ever want. He was probably in his 50s and been in and out of many, many dealerships. Harwood had no automobile experience, but somehow the two had met, and he'd put all the money into the dealership. Well, to be the owner-operator of a dealership, to be the man who is on what we call paragraph third, he signs and he speaks as the dealer. You must own 1/4 of the assets of the dealership. So, oh yes, you cannot be on paragraph third unless you own at least 25%. Now you can own the whole thing and be on there, but you must have at least 25%. Well, Dewey didn't have any money, and it developed as the depositions were going on that the real problem was that Dewey didn't have any money at all in the dealership. Harwood had 100% of the money in, but Harwood, without automobile experience, would not be allowed to sign on paragraph third. So the two of them got together and lied to us and said that Dewey had 25%. Dewey signed as the dealer on paragraph third. Well, then they had a big falling out. Harwood ran an aluminum siding business in Detroit. He didn't even live in Hastings, Michigan. He went up there once a month to see how things are going, and he got automobiles for he and his wife. It's a big deal for him to get a couple of automobiles on dealer plates. Dewey got upset with the whole thing, and he wrote a letter to Oldsmobile and terminated the franchise. Oh yeah, and boom. And so the next thing Harwood knows, he's no longer a dealer, and he just had a fit, so he takes us to court. So in the course of the depositions, Bob Berger and I had to get involved, and they wanted to bring Ed Ruth back in from, well, he was regional manager at that point in time. No, he was, where had he gone to? Zone manager in Charlotte, I believe. And they wanted to bring him back, but it never got quite to that point because the GM attorneys had finally, apparently on a preliminary motion to the judge, said, and the judge threw the whole thing out because he said, you know, the man was the only one that could sign for the dealership, and he terminated. Mr. Harwood, you don't have a case, and finally threw the thing out. But it was interesting to get involved in it at a relatively early age. I'm sure there are a lot of those that are still in existence, but until the two partners have a falling out, you really don't know what's going on under the table in a dealership. Other terminations can be done if a man is convicted of a felony. I don't know of any of those personally, but I'm sure there have been some. And let's see, I'm trying to think of some of the others. There have been others that are written into the selling agreement that a dealer could be terminated for. Well, they're kind of nebulous in a way of not taking care of customers, and put it in simple language. Well, how can you prove that? These are the types of things they're wrestling with even today, that if a dealer doesn't have adequate service facilities, and he sells a lot of cars and the customers can't get them serviced, should you terminate the dealer and then go to court and try to prove to a jury who is outside of our business that we were right in terminating the man and taking away his livelihood? And the attorneys get very nervous about doing that. They probably shy away from more of those than maybe they should. Does he have good customer relations? We have what they call a CSI, Customer Service Index, and it ranks the dealer. We contact dealers' customers and ask them, do you have problems with your car? Yes. Did you get it serviced? Did they take care of it? No, they didn't. Well, the black marks that go against the dealer reflect in what they call a Customer Service Index, and every dealer in the United States is ranked on a Customer Service Index. The very best dealer happens to be one out in the Omaha zone, and the worst one happens to be in the Chicago area, and those are the extremes, from one extreme to the other. The one man has almost 100% customer satisfaction, never has an unhappy customer. The other one has 60% of his customers or better unhappy. You know, it's one extreme to the other. And according to the contract, our sales and service agreement we sign with the dealers, which now we do every 5 years, not every year. It got to be quite a job to get every dealer to come in every year and sign a contract. It didn't make much sense. And then the dealer said, that's a sword of Damocles hanging over our head. Every year you're threatening us if we don't do this and that and the other. So we've changed at the behest of the dealer councils, really, to 5 years. The death of the dealer, if he hasn't signed a survivor agreement, could end up as the dealership closing. Most dealers have signed a widow's addendum. It gives his widow a certain number of years, probably a couple of years, to maybe take over and run the dealership if she can get a qualified manager. There are successor addendums for sons or son-in-laws, or even, I suppose, brothers or things like that. And generally, General Motors is pretty liberal. The man has put all his time and effort and money into this dealership. We're not about to, he said, you died, boom, goodbye to the family type of thing. They've been very, very fair over the years in taking care of widows or a successor that's being named. If a successor is named and it's a son, we normally watch pretty closely while the dealer is, after the dealer signs that addendum, we watch the son pretty closely to make sure, well, is he getting any training in the business? He's supposedly signed as a successor, but he's off to Yale going to college taking art and wants to be a ballet dancer or something in New York. Why should we have him as a successor? You know, so there's a fine line that you have to ask the dealer to not cross over. If he wants somebody as a successor, we want somebody who's interested in the business and has some training in the business. And I think that's our right. He would certainly ask us not to appoint somebody as general manager of Oldsmobile who was a flute player in the New York Philharmonic or something. I mean, it's silly, but that's the type of thing that I think you have to insist on. I can't think of any other terminations that we've had for other reasons. I'm sure there's some that are spelled out in there, but the main ones are closing, bankruptcy. Even in bankruptcy, if he goes into Chapter 11, he can operate like any business can in this country for a while.
What is Chapter 11?
Chapter 11 bankruptcy protects you from your creditors. In other words, you want to try to bring the business back. You can't pay your current debts, but you really think that given some protection at the moment from creditors who could close you up tomorrow, you can file for Chapter 11. I think some of our banks, airlines, Eastern Airlines is running on that right now. And the dealer could do that. And I don't think we would object to that if it kept the doors open. Now, if it looks like it's a losing proposition and the man has never made any money and Chapter 11 is just prolonging something that's going to happen, then probably Oldsmobile and or General Motors would be rather reluctant to go along for too many years on a Chapter 11.
Is there a limit on
I don't know whether there is or not, Helen. I'm not into the legal end of the business. I would assume there must be some kind of an end because certainly the creditors can't be expected to wait forever for their money. Normally they would be see, the thing we would probably object to more than anything else is that on Chapter 11 the court appoints someone to run the business. Now, they're going to send somebody in to run the business who's never sold a car in his life, doesn't know anything about service or used cars, and that would be extremely hard for us to swallow, that the guy that's going to come in there has no experience. Now, if you could put somebody in there who had been a dealer and maybe retired, and we could hire him back as a maybe that could be something that could be worked out with the court. I don't really know. We've had some cases of caretakers moving into dealerships where they've closed, and I think a good friend of mine that was a dealer in the Detroit zone here had recently been brought in by Motor Holding as a caretaker in a dealership where the dealer died and his wife didn't want any part of it, and they hired Don to go in as a caretaker for a few months and see if they could make the thing revive. It didn't work, but they did hire him as a caretaker. They didn't want to lose the dealer point. They didn't want to lose the outlet for business, naturally.
Now, you mentioned Motors Holding.
Motor Holding is a financial arm of General Motors.
What is that?
Well, if you want to become a dealer, Helen wants to become a dealer, and you go through, let's say, the Dealer Academy, and they put you to work in different... The Dealer Academy is in Detroit. It's out in Warren at the training center, the General Motors Training Center in Warren, which is the large one. The Dealer Academy normally has been used, or lately has been used, for us to train minorities, black, female, Hispanics, because the government has asked us to make more dealers, the higher percent of them in female, black, Hispanic, and minority type thing. So the Dealer Academy, as I'm aware of it, normally has 20 to 30 trainees in it. They get some schooling at the training center. They get some schooling up at what used to be GMI in Flint, which is run as an independent company, but still has allied parts of it with the automobile business. They are sent out to work in dealerships, given on-the-spot training, and then each of the divisions, as they have a an open point. In other words, we've had a dealer in Hillsboro, Ohio, and the dealer for some reason goes out of business, and we want to put another dealer in Hillsboro, Ohio as an example. Well, maybe that's time to put a black in, or Hispanic. And so you talk to some of the candidates at the school who have been in the program for a year and say, are you interested in Hillsboro, Ohio? I might be. How much money does he have? Well, maybe he's only got $10,000 or $20,000. What can you raise? And so Motor Holding will go in and put him into that dealership. They will supply the capital as long as he's got some minimum amount. He should be, now remember, I said he had to be 1/3 to be on paragraph 3rd. Well, or 1/4. Well, Motor Holding will go in, and he can probably become a dealer at less than that. And he signs an agreement that he is the dealer, but really in respect, the Motor Holding, a division of General Motors, is really the dealer at that point. They got all the money in there, almost all of it. And they help him run that business. And they watch him very closely. They have a financial analyst that comes in there probably a couple times a month and checks to make sure that he's making money, he's doing the right things, he's keeping the right accounting in his books. And they allow the dealer to buy them out over a period of time. And they really like to be out of there in 5 years' time. He can buy them out earlier if his business gets very good. Motor Holding wants to be out of that business in 5 years. It's been a great, great boon to a lot of people that wanted to become dealers that didn't have the capital. Not just minorities, but a lot of dealers started in with Motor Holding. I have a friend who is a dealer in the Detroit area, and he wanted to get out of the business. He wanted his son and the sales manager to become the dealers as partners. But he didn't want to sell directly to them. He wanted Motor Holding to buy him out and Motor Holding to be their boss. He didn't want to be his son's boss. He kept the property and he leases the property to him, but he didn't want to be the holder of the notes from the two boys. And Motor Holding said fine. So Motor Holding bought him out completely. Then we signed the two boys, his son and the sales manager as the two dealers. Motor Holding is their boss until they buy Motor Holding out. And that was a good way to do it because he thought it would be very hard to be both these fellows had worked for him, his son and the sales manager, and suddenly, he's sitting on the outside, no longer active in the business, and yet they got the feeling he's looking over their shoulder. He didn't want that, so he's got Motor Holding. Motor Holding is the loaner, the bank behind dealers who need to get a start in the business, don't have the capital.
Now, they do charge an interest.
Well, yes, they're making some profit along the way. Obviously, they're not totally altruistic, but they charge. They give you good service for what you're paying them. They're getting a proportion of the profits. I'm not sure what it is, Helen. I really don't. Somebody could tell you that.
Well, now, Tom, let me ask you. You say the sales manager and the son are now partners.
Yes.
Could each have 50%, and then two people be on?
Yes, you can do that. You can do that, and they could both be signatories on paragraph 3. We really like to have one person to deal with on paragraph 3. In this case, I think it's a 51-49 that they did. You can have a corporation as a dealer and have a president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. But we're going to say to the 4 people, we're going to say one of you is going to be on paragraph 3, not all 4 of you. Now, you can have a codicil to the side that handles the assets of the business. We don't care what you do there. But one person's going to sign as, normally it's the president of that corporation.
You mentioned the open dealer point a moment
Yeah.
ago. How are dealer points selected, and do we have a group of people who determine, like a survey of different areas?
Each division has their own surveyor, or they have at least for the last, I'd say 15 years. Before that, it was done pretty much by the corporation. Based on the R.L. Polk company, who issues car population numbers, as I would call it. How many cars are registered in Wayne County, Clinton County, Macomb County? How many cars are registered in let's take the Lansing as an example, Ingham County. How many dealers selling a product should there be in Ingham County? Well, if you kind of establish that there are so many cars of each make registered yearly in Ingham County, you could kind of back into a number that says, well, maybe we'd like to have because of the number of cars, let's take Ford Motor as an example. Let's stay away from Oldsmobile because that's our headquarters and that gets a little blurry. But in Ford Motor, Ford might decide that they wanted to have each of their dealers probably sell close to a couple thousand cars a year to be quite profitable. So if they looked at the number of Fords that are registered in Ingham County each year, they might decide, well, you could support 2 dealers in Ingham County with Ford. And then they look a little further and say, well, if you did that, you're going to have the 2 dealers very close to each other in Lansing, East Lansing and Lansing. That doesn't take care of the other part of Ingham County going down towards Fowlerville or something like that. So they might decide to cut back a little bit, and they finally arrive at the fact, well, let's make 2 1,500-car-a-year dealers in Lansing, and let's have one down the road at Fowlerville or whatever. But they do it strictly on the car population. And then we would be no different than Ford Motor. Once we had established we wanted to have 3 dealers in that area. Well, if you started this whole process from the day the earth was created, it would be fine and simple. But here we are coming along, and you're suddenly going to get into car populations and where should dealers be, and we're getting into this, let's say, in the late 50s or early 60s. You've already got dealers almost everywhere, and you've got a lot of these dealers that I mentioned earlier that were signed up because they just wanted to buy a car cheap and ran a gas station in the 30s and 40s. They still exist. So now the corporation has become involved in it because there's another thing to consider, and that is we might have a town that can support a Chevrolet dealership. And in that same town, because of what happened years ago, we've got an Oldsmobile dealer by himself, you got a Buick dealer by himself, you have no Cadillac, and maybe you don't have a Pontiac. The Chevrolet dealer is doing very well, but the Oldsmobile and the Buick aren't doing all that well because they're very low volume. The registration, the business isn't there that will keep on supporting them. As the businesses started to get larger, the people have moved away from these towns and gone to big cities for many reasons, so the population of people has shrunk and the car population shrinks along with it. So the corporation said if anything should happen in that town, we're not going to replace the Oldsmobile dealer as an exclusive. We are going to make Oldsmobile part of Chevrolet. Then you're going to have a Chevrolet Olds dual. If something happens to the Buick dealer, that will also become. So those 2 dealers would probably be issued a letter at the next contract, 5 years or whenever that comes, a stay with you letter that says, we will stay with you as long as you are alive. However, when something happens to you, we are going to dual Chevrolet and Oldsmobile because we can't really support a single, we couldn't replace you here as a single. Nobody in their right mind would buy your dealership because you do a lot of business because it's you and it's goodwill and you're Joe Schmatz and you've been here forever. But you must realize that it won't exist by itself. The volume will not support a dealer by himself. So the corporation has what they call a master plan. And all across the United States, you can look at any master plan and says, here's where it should, this is the way it should be. You should have a Chevrolet, Olds, Cadillac, and you should have a Buick, Pontiac, GMC. That's a pretty normal lineup, 3 and 3, for towns of a certain size. As the towns get bigger, everybody should be separate. As the towns get very small, you might have one General Motors dealer, and he has all 6 lines. Now, it gets confusing when you talk about Chevrolet trucks and GMC being in the same dealership. They're almost the same product. So sometimes one of those gets shuffled. Well, Chevrolet's already there, so GMC truck gets the short shift on that. But there's all kinds of configurations in between, and sometimes they get into some rather weird ones because of what has happened in the progression of getting from where we are now to where you would like to be. You end up with some odd dueling combinations because you didn't quite get the Chevrolet, Olds, and Cadillac, and you're going in that direction, and you end up with a Cadillac Chevrolet. But Oldsmobile has been part, like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Oldsmobile has been dual with Buick for so many years up there. And it's just always been that way, that those 2 are still together and the Allen family still controls it, and there's no reason to split it up. And Cadillac joined that, so you've got a Buick, Olds, Cadillac 3-way. And Chevrolet sits out here pretty much by itself in Cedar Rapids. Now, maybe the master plan for Cedar Rapids might be to have an exclusive Olds at some point in time. But maybe may never happen either. In Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac are very happy with the Allen brothers the way things are run right now. The successors are running it because all the Allens have died, but there's no reason to break it up. It's been extremely successful. So you might have a master plan, but you certainly wouldn't tinker with something that's that's not broken now. You're not, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the master plan is that if things blow up or change drastically, we should try to be in the direction of the master plan. And the master plan is based on car populations, and they try to look ahead at what trends are, how are things going to be in the future. We've had a man at Oldsmobile. We still have a man now, Bill Segrist, at the moment, I think, is doing that. Jim Harsand did it until he retired, and it was part of the O&A department that signed dealer contracts, and that was to do surveys. The reason you have your own is that the corporation might have a plan out here that looks very good on paper, but you looking at it here, like the Allen brothers, say, wait a minute, I know that's what they want to do in Cedar Rapids. Why would we want to split up that Allen? That's very good for us the way it is. The Allens were scrupulous in getting all three of those divisions exactly the penetration they wanted. Just like they orchestrated it. I contacted them, and they were fabulous people. They'd been in business, I guess, with Oldsmobile since, well, they had a picture of their father with an Oldsmobile, 1904. Oh, way back. They had to be one of the oldest dealers in existence. And then they took on Buick, then they took on Cadillac, and they just became multi-millionaires, the nicest people you ever... They were good friends of Harry Banks's. In fact, I heard about them from him probably years and years and years before I ever went out to the Omaha zone. Very successful. But they also knew that to be successful, they had to take care of their customers. They had excellent customer relations. They also knew to keep the three divisions happy, they had to give Oldsmobile its penetration, Buick its penetration, and Cadillac its penetration of the market. And they were scrupulous about doing that.
Well, when you have three GM divisions dual, isn't there a business management control? Doesn't one of them?
Yes, one of them has Buick, and in that case...
how do you determine?
Well, you do a little... If you're dual with Chevrolet, Chevrolet normally has the business management control. The only time you would vary from that is if it was an existing Oldsmobile dealer and Chevrolet was added on to Oldsmobile. We were there first. We might retain the business management control, but in most cases we would give it to Chevrolet. It doesn't really make any difference.
What does business management control?
Well, that's what I was going to say. It doesn't mean as much as it used to. It used to have more clout than it has nowadays when each of the divisions were kind of autonomous, more than they are with the new reorganization. Business management control was kind of a bragging point. You controlled that dealership. Well, you didn't control anything any more than you did any other dealership, but zone managers like to talk about it. It was more air than anything else. It made you responsible for collecting the parts account, and so sometimes you wished you didn't have business management control. If the dealer was a late payment, you'd rather have somebody else running after the check instead of you. So I don't think it had any great effect on anybody, really.
No real significance.
No real significance. If you had to do, if you had something that had to do with a corporation survey that had to be done dealer by dealer, the one with business management control would be the one that had to go in and do the survey. So it made more work for you sometimes if you had business management control than it would have the other way around. It was, to me, it was nothing. I think at one point in time it probably had much more significance, and I can't, maybe in the 20s or 30s, and I can't tell you what it was, Helen. I wasn't around working at that time to even know.
Sure.
But they used to talk about it more in the old days than they ever do now, so it's paled into insignificance, I think.
Well, in a way, your area, and even when you were in the field, your car distribution and sales analysis worked pretty close with organization and analysis.
No, not really. Not really. No. We did under the old system. The old system was based, when they tried to come out of that Sloan distribution system, there was another interim phase they went through when Emmett Feely was here as general sales manager. He had a great idea that distribution should be tied directly to registrations. Well, then we had to go to O&A to get the registration data, which they kept, and then you had a form that said, here's the registrations in the area, so that dealer should get 3 cars a month, because that's what, there's 36 cars a year, Oldsmobiles are registered in there, then he should have 3 cars a month. The thing he forgot was maybe the dealer doesn't want 3 cars. And when I got out to the Omaha zone as assistant zone manager, they were fighting with this Feely system. Now in Detroit, and when I was car distributor, we'd already decided it didn't work, and we just didn't tell Mr. Feely, we just ignored it. Because we looked at it and said it is absolutely ridiculous. You cannot You cannot expect this dealer to sell 3 cars a month just because there are 3 cars registered. We knew of a lot of cases where the dealer didn't sell any cars. All the cars in that area were bought outside of the area because the dealer had such a bad reputation, nobody would deal with him. But under the Feely plan, you had to give him 3, and he didn't want 3. He didn't even send you 3 orders. What are you going to do with those cars? And then you had to write a discrepancy report every time you deviated from this thing. It was the stupidest thing in the world. But I got out to Omaha, and there they are, sitting there fighting with their system. And Tom Shelton was his own manager, and he didn't really know much about distribution, didn't want to know much about distribution, and I was brand new coming out from being a car distributor in Detroit. And he said, boy, he says, this system isn't working. I said, well, throw it out. Throw it out? Oh, my God, we can't do that. I said, we just threw it out in Detroit. We haven't used it in a year. He said, you're kidding me. I said, no. He said, well, what did anybody say? I said, who's going to know except you now know. You're the only one outside Detroit. But he was aghast that we would, throw something out. And I said, it doesn't work. And he said, no, I know it doesn't work. We're finding that out. And he said, we're spending more time writing discrepancy reports. Maquoketa, Iowa, how come you didn't put 3 cars into Maquoketa, Iowa? Well, the dealer hasn't sent us any orders in 90 days, Stupid. So you had to put those cars somewhere else, which caused another discrepancy because you over-preferenced cars for another dealer. Out of the total, they had to go somewhere. So oh, terrible, for nothing. So we threw it out. We just stopped using it in Omaha, and the sales started to go much better. And then finally, I guess somebody must have convinced Emmett Feely that the thing wasn't working too well, and then he was replaced by Mac Warden, and Mac Warden came out with doing a big tour around the country, and immediately everybody sensed that he didn't think the system was worth a damn either, so by that time it was long gone. And then we got into what they call the computerized preference, which Tom Shavacco and Gordy Osborne, some of his people developed, but there were all kinds of things all kinds of people over a lot of years that tried to develop some kind of a distribution system, and everybody's got their own idea how it ought to work. The thing with the Feely system, the big failing was that I think he was naive in assuming that if a dealer signs a contract with us and we give him an area of responsibility, that dealer automatically is going to sell that number of cars. The dealer never signed anything that says, I will sell X number of cars. Nor do we ever sign anything with a dealer saying we're going to furnish you X number of cars. We aren't going to hang ourselves to some dealer who suddenly decides he doesn't want to sell cars, or he wants to sell them for twice the price. And if he doesn't get twice the price, he won't sell them. So we don't sign anything, and we don't expect the dealer to sign an agreement written in blood that he's going to sell 100 cars a year. He said, what do I want to sign that for? I might want to sell 200, but I might only sell 75. So there's no written agreement with a dealer on either side that we will give him 100 cars a year or he will sell 100 cars a year. So you have to have some system that is responsive to each dealer's level of sales as accurately as you can do it. Because there's nothing in writing that says anybody's going to agree to do this or that.
What about the dealer council? Were you involved?
Oh, always, yeah. I had to go up and defend many of our systems in front of the National Dealer Council because they didn't perceive what it was doing, and there'd be a lot of flack about it. I developed a system that we use now in ordering cars. It's called the Select-A-Unit system. Back in, well, let's see, I was a coordinator at the time, and I thought that the old way of ordering cars was that you had a check sheet. And if you wanted a hydromatic, you checked option A. If you want power steering, you checked option C. You want power brakes, you checked option L. And you went down this big, long checklist. Well, the big problem is that reading down this checklist that had about 60 or 70 options on, you're going to forget one of these. You're going to miss something. And when you miss something, the car came in, it wasn't what you ordered. Now, if you're the customer, you don't take delivery, so the dealer sticks the car out in the back 40 here and looks for another customer someday for that car. But we had so many horror cases over the years of dealers forgetting to put on air conditioning in Arizona, forgetting to put on power steering in a 98 or something when it was an option, or forgetting to, and they ordering green cars with blue trim, and all these things that could go wrong went wrong somewhere during the year. And contacting dealers, I used to see these cars sitting out in the back of the used car lot. Where'd that come from? Well, a sales manager here ordered 12 cars, forgot to put power brakes in any of them, and we still got 5 of them left, or something like that. So I developed an ordering system called a select unit. And it had, if you ordered the car and you ordered a Delta 88, we said, okay, now you got to order a select unit. Select unit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. And they all had different levels of equipment. But you had to order one of them. Order one, and that had the items that you would not ever want to order a car without. 2 added a few items, 3 added a few, 4 added. But even if you just took the bare minimum, it was still a saleable car somewhere in the United States. And so I developed this system, and of course, the orders, instead of having this big form with all this stuff on it, it came out to a little order form, smaller than that. It had nothing on it but dealer name and address, a series of the car, color, and select unit, SAU. And of course, some of these dealers went right up in arms. Rocky and John Drummy, they just had a fit. And they called up Bob Berger and were complaining to Bob when I first designed it. And I had to go down and talk to him. I said, what's wrong with this system? They finally admitted. They tried to order their wife's car, and without the big check sheet, they couldn't order. They ordered 1 car a year.
Oh, dear.
Sales managers thought it was the greatest thing in the world because they'd never order a car that was unsaleable again. But the dealer council, because of Rocky and John, who were both on the National Dealer Council, and so Bill Buxton said to Gordy, he said, boy, we're getting a lot of heat on that new damn system we put in. And Gordy said, well, he said, they're going to like it. Buxton said, well, it's Tom's idea, let him go defend it. So I had to go up and defend it to the National Dealer Council. But I took him right through it. And I looked at the 2 guys I talked to, and I said, would both of you like to speak, or you want me to tell the story? And I'd known both of them from Detroit, you know. Now you go ahead. And I said, well, we had a couple of gentlemen in the room that didn't like the system, and maybe some of you had the same thing. You get a blank piece of paper, so what do I do with it? Because you can't order a car for yourself or your wife or something like that. Don't condemn the system, because it is the best system you'll ever see for ordering cars that I've ever seen. And it's now used by just about every division. But it was something, again, I had something in the back of my mind that just said, you know, why do we waste so much money ordering unsaleable cars? There's got to be a way to solve this. And I saw something that they were doing up in GM of Canada. It was slightly in that direction, but they were trying to do it for a different reason. They were trying to do it from the manufacturing standpoint of grouping options. I said, well, I don't care about that, but maybe that's going to be something down the road, and they're trying to do that even today with option packages. But what I was after was putting those options in a row and starting with the most popular option on that car line over the last several years of experience, then the number 2, then the number 3, and we added each one of them on and put it in the group based on its penetration of usage in the year before. So it was a very logical thing. We weren't trying to jam anything onto the dealer. All we wanted to do was make the saleable car. And it worked out pretty well. Well, I forgot what we were talking about when I got off on that tangent, but...
we were talking about the dealer council.
Oh, yeah, the dealer council. Yeah, and the dealer councils are, I think, are much more meaningful now than when they first started. See, the dealer council, when they first started, we'd send out ballots to the dealers, and they would send them into the zone office. And the zone manager would sit there, and he'd look through the ballots and decide, boy, I don't want that guy in the dealer council. He'd throw the ballot in the wastebasket.
Oh, now let me see. These ballots would be for
for the district. See, we had, in the zone, you had a zone dealer council first, and that was 2 representatives from each of your districts.
Okay.
And then the zone representatives, first and second choices, went to 2 out of the zone were elected by when the zone got together, the district council members would elect a zone representative. He went to the regional, and then the regional elected one that went to the national, 2 that went to the national. So we had, in the national council at that time, there were 6 regions, so we had 12 members of the dealer council. 1 was a carryover member, the other was the new. The carryover would fade out, the new would take over as number 1 representative, and the new and elected would be number 2, so you had a continuity going. The man would be there 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. But in the old ways it was done before, the zone manager didn't like some dealers, didn't want him on the dealer council because maybe he didn't want the dealer telling any tales out of school on what he had done in the zone or something, so he'd throw the ballots away, and so you only elected who the zone manager wanted to be on the dealer council. So you didn't really get anything productive done at all. Well, it didn't take long for Lansing to figure out what was going on, and so the council was, all the ballots went directly to Lansing, which was a much better way to run it. So you got a guy on there that bitched a lot. Why not? If he's got a bitch, let's listen to it. Why keep covering it up, you know, and it festers? So, sure, you got some really characters on the dealer council. We had one guy on the council one time, and I said something to Jim Maddox. I said, I've never even heard his name before. He's National Dealer Council. And Jim says he has nothing to do with the business. Well, how'd he get on here? Well, the dealers in the zone all like him. He's strictly a money investor in the dealership somewhere out in California. Didn't know anything about the business. Well, why is he sitting on a National Dealer Council? The rest of the dealers took us to task on that, and we said, well, what can we do about it? He was elected. He was elected by the region. Before that, by the zone. Don't get on us about it. Now, in the old days, they would have thrown his name out. The zone manager would have thrown his name out and never let him get that far. But I think that was a good thing to happen, because the other dealers started to realize, well, this is our forum, and that idiot is on here. What do we need this for? So I think in some of their own groups, they started to tighten it down a little bit. Say, look, friendship's friendship, but let's get somebody on the National Dealer Council that's going to do some good. Not just pass somebody along because he's a nice guy and doesn't know anything about our business. That is not doing us any good.
So you feel that the dealer councils are really productive?
I do, and I think they brought up some things, and I've sat in on I used to sit on every one of them on the national level from I guess from 80 to 87, and I thought they were very good. Now, sure, you get some guys on the council that got their own little axe to grind, and they forget they're supposed to be representing all dealers nationally, and they get one little area of something happened, and somebody turned them down on an AFA warranty request once, and that's all they want to talk about. Well, that wastes. But the other dealers are getting to the point they shut them up now. Say, wait a minute, you take care of that with Ivan Stebbins at some point in time, but don't take up our time, and usually that gets them out. They brought up some very good points. They have some, and I think management needs to hear that. Management hears a filtered version of everything. The district manager hears it from the dealer, and he relates it to the assistant zone manager and zone manager, and it gets related to a regional manager. Now they're assistant general sales managers, and by the time it gets up to the general sales manager, it's gone through too many years. It's like the old Rockwell painting. It doesn't resemble the original story at all anymore. And if somebody has something they want to cover up or color a little bit, they've done it. The National Dealer Council hopefully brings something out that has been festering somewhere in the dealer body, and hopefully relatively unfiltered. Sure, it's been maybe filtered through one more mouth, but not a whole bunch of people. And we know it's slanted a little more toward the dealer, just like the other version was slanted a little more towards the wholesale by the time we heard about it. But you can't get out and talk to every dealer every month. That's impossible. And I think management at the top level needs to get direct input that is not filtered, slanted, biased. There are a lot of people in Oldsmobile that never pick up a phone. There was a cartoon in the paper the other day, a Sally Forth column. I thought it was so funny. The secretary is going to be out for the day, and he says, "Who's going to answer my phone?" She said, "You'll have to do it yourself." I answer my own phone for all the years I ever worked for Oldsmobile. Well, Monica was my secretary for a while, and Monica liked to answer the phone. I said, "No, I just soon do it myself. You can pick up, if we're busy, sure, but I just soon pick up the phone." I never wanted to think that people couldn't get a hold of me. That's ridiculous. I hate answering machines. Absolutely, I would not have one. They wanted to put one in years ago, and in the offices that I was in the zone, and I said I would not have one. Don't have one in Lansing. I guess now you'd have to have one because everybody's got one, but it goes through EDS. But they just irritate me. I don't have one at home, and I would not have one. I always figure we had to be accessible. If you're going to be in a business where you're dealing with dealers, when I call a dealership, I expect to talk to him if he's there. And when he calls wherever I was, I expect he should be able to talk to me, unless we're in the middle of something very serious or away. But nothing ever gets better by delaying it. The worst thing you have to do, you should do the first thing that morning. Get it off your chest and get it out of the way. It never gets any easier. I've had to fire people. I've had to demote people. And it doesn't get any easier. When I went, I had to get rid of 15 people at the end there, and I just decided I'd been through that twice before, and I was going to be one of the 15 this time. Not going to go through it again. I'm going to be 60 years old. I wasn't going to shorten my life by carrying that around and trying to work any more than that. To be very honest with you, a lot of the fun had gone out of the business. 36 years were a lot of fun. The last 2 were not fun. The changes, time will tell whether this change to BOC, CPC, and all the reorganization will do any good for General Motors. There's still mixed opinions. Too early to tell. But
It will be for a while.
yeah, it was something that I didn't particularly need, didn't appreciate why they were doing it. Sat in on some of the molding conferences with Joe Sanchez when he was here. But
What kind of name?
oh, when he died, I said I cried. And I hadn't cried since my father died. But I just thought he was the greatest, the smartest man I ever worked for in Oldsmobile or General Motors. He could talk about any subject at any time, and just a super guy. I just felt so sorry when he passed away. I thought we lost one of the best people we'd ever have. I really do.
A lot of people don't.
Oh, yeah, just a great, great guy. He had such a touch. Tom Medill works for me, does great work, you know, all the backup data and everything. And he came, let's see, I took him up to see Sanchez when we were doing a forecast. Bud Melky and I went up, and Tom went with us. And I'd introduced him, and we only spent 10 minutes there or something like that. And about 2 or 3 weeks had gone by, and Sanchez walked down in my office one day, and I was down at the other end talking to Vance McWhorter about something on the ordering information. And Sanchez came in the door and just walked right up, and Tom was sitting there doing something. Tom looked up like this, the general manager. He said, "Tom, I wonder if you could answer a question for me," you know, just. And Tom was just elated, you know. Even, you know, Maddox couldn't remember Tom Medill's name from time to time. You know, he didn't see him that often. But here's a man that had only met him once, called him by name, and knew that he had the data he wanted. You know, Sanchez just had a marvelous mind. I mean, he just absorbed everything. He came into Oldsmobile. There was a lot of wonder about, here's a guy coming out of Brazil. What's he going to know about our business? But didn't take long.
Learned it fast. I think it's
Oh, yeah, he picked it up awfully rapidly. He'd gotten somebody to send him some figures while he was in Brazil. He knew he was coming here, and it was maybe a week before, and some data that we had done. I think Bob Cook probably put it together and sent it to him. And we had a little meeting in Maddox's office. Cook brought Sanchez in, and we just sat around the table talking about things. And Joe said, "I see your sales forecast is 830,000. And Maddox looked over at me and said, "Where would he get that figure?" And I said, "No, that's not our sales forecast." I said, "But that number does ring a bell with me." And Joe said, "Well, if you figure out what it is, let me know." So I went up in the elevator, and apparently Maddox and Cook and Sanchez spent a little time after the rest of us left. And I was going towards the elevator to go up, and because 830,000 was the number of our forecasted domestic production for the next year, not counting GM of Canada. And yet that number stuck in his brain with a division he hadn't even seen yet. And the elevator door opened. I went to get on, and Maddox and Cook were, Sanchez and Cook were sitting. I said, "I just found out what the 830,000 was." I said, "That's our domestic production for next year." "Oh, that's right." He said, "Your sales forecast is 1,039,000. And Cook just kind of looked at me like this, and I said, "Yeah, that's absolutely correct." He said, "Well, I knew I got the numbers mixed up somewhere." Just everything that went into that. And he used to get Ed Vogt. Ed Vogt, you know, was great with numbers. And Ed Vogt would get his calculator out, and before and we're going on a forecast or something, or sales staff, general staff, and Vogt would start to put the numbers in, and Sanchez would give him the answer in his head. Just, he could do numbers in his head just fantastically.
It's almost unbelievable.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And his wife, Joy, just a great person, a lovely person. Yeah. Very sad, yeah.
Now, you worked some with Ed Vogt, too.
Oh, sure. We used to have great fights, you know. Until I think the problem at the beginning with, Bernard Davis later on, the problem with most of the financial people is that they have a hard time appreciating the sales side of the business. It looks like all the sales department does is want a lot of money to be spent for a very, very uncertain return. There's no guarantee that an advertising program or a sales contest is going to generate any revenue. How do you ever prove that? How can you prove that you sold a car because of an ad? Unless the person writes in and said, "I bought the car because I saw it in the magazine." But nobody ever does that. So the accounting people are looking at all this money. Now, when somebody builds a car and it goes off the end of the line and that money is transferred into our pocket, that's there. They can count that. when you get into the sales department, the financial people have a terrible time trying to appreciate the sales end of our business. And Ed Vogt was a good example of that to begin with. And he and I used to go round and round because he said to me one time, he had all of his people behind him and he came roaring down there to see Gordy. He went out of his office around the corner and into ours, and Gordy was gone. And he marched all of his people in there and he said, I just found out that we're spending 50 cents a car more to transport our cars than Chevrolet pays. I said, well, that doesn't surprise me. He said, it doesn't. 50 cents a car? Do you realize how much money? I said, yeah, I can add and subtract and multiply. He said, why would we do that? He said, we got to stop doing that. And I said, no, we're not going to stop doing that. He said, what do you mean? And his people behind him, you know, he had them kind of cowed, you know. And I said, 2 reasons, Ed. Number one, Chevrolet builds in more plants than we do. So they are closer to every one of their dealers, just from that standpoint. Well, yeah, he said, I could see that. And he said, they don't have to transport as far, right? He said, okay. But number 2, if you just wipe that out, we still would not do what Chevrolet does. They tie a dealer to a plant. Every Camaro that dealer gets is going to come out of the plant in Georgia. None of them will come out of the plant in California because he only gets his cars from the closest plant. If they're only built in 2 plants, and he's right in the middle of the United States, if he's 10 miles closer in Kansas to one than the other, that's where he'll get all his cars, regardless of even if that plant's operating. And Ed said, I don't believe that. I said, well, you check that out and you'll find out it's true. But what we do, we don't care. We're building Cutlass. At that time, we were building Cutlasses in 5 different plants. And I said, we put that order into the plant based on how fast we can get that car to the customer. We don't worry about what it costs. If that's a sold order, I'm not talking about stock orders, but sold orders, we put it into the plant that will get it to the customer the fastest, and we pay the freight. And he thought for a minute, and he said, you and I will discuss this later. And out he went with all his people. Never brought it up again. But he at the end, became very sales-minded. And I had the same problem with Bernard Davis when he came in. And at the end, when Bernard left here, he was very sales-minded. It took longer with that vote. I understand he's lost 100 pounds. It looks like $1 million.
You wouldn't know him.
I guess I wouldn't.
He seems taller.
I'll
His
be
eyes
down. Really?
are open more.
Great.
A very nice-looking man
Yeah.
that we couldn't see before.
That's right. That's right. No, he and I got along very well at the end. We had some go-arounds, a couple screaming sessions. But,
what about Jim Maddox? What kind of a man was he to work with?
For me, I had no problems working with Jim Maddox. He used to say to me once in a while, he'd say, well, us old car distributors got to stick together. See, he was a car distributor one time in St. Louis many years before. So he had a kind of he had a little appreciation of what a really grubby job the car distributor had. He did the hardest job in the zone by far, worked the longest hours and got the least thanks, and probably less pay than a lot of people that worked a hell of a lot less than he did. So Jim always had an appreciation of that, and that's all I ever had to do once in a while if I wanted to get something. Like have a car distributors meeting, even if the budget was kind of low. I said, the guys deserve a meeting this year, and he said, you take them anywhere you want. Never had any problem with Jim. I always got along very well with him, and I don't think we even ever had an argument. He used to do things that he'd say, well, I come down at the end of the year and we'll set the station wagon allotments for the year. I mean, how many we want to build. I said, why do I want to bother you with that? Well, Gordy always came down, and I said, all you ever do is you want to raise the station wagon production because that summer market is going to be there, and we want to build those cars in the summer market. But I said, when we add up all the percents, you've got the total to 110. We got to cut it back to 100% anyway. Oh, hell, he said, go do it your own way. No. But it was something that he realized. Somebody sitting on the fringe of the business that doesn't do that every month and is going to do it one time for the whole year is not going to come out even. So but Jim and I got along fine. We have never had a problem. Buxton and I really never had a problem when he was salesman. I don't know that I had any problems with the sales department people, with possible a couple of exceptions, but better not spoken about.
Okay, now you work pretty closely with Bob Cook.
Oh yes, very much so, very much. And that was kind of a strained relationship at the very beginning because he and Gordy got along so well, and suddenly I replaced Gordy. I had to kind of work my way into that a little bit. I think I did it with humor a little too. People used to sit in the staff meetings, and Cook would talk about something, and then we would go out after the meetings and we would try to do our everyday business, and somebody would say, well, Bob Cook wants such and such done. So I hadn't heard about that. Where'd you hear that? Well, he said he brought it up to staff. I said, no, I was in staff, and he never mentioned it at all. People would use his name to try to get things done. So one day, Ken O'Donnell came in, and there was a running change going to be made on the Omega, and they were going to change the chrome wheel opening moldings on the front and rear, and it was going to be a running change in production because they were lowering the body side molding. Now, the two chrome moldings had to go all the way down to where the body side molding ran along the lower rail, and they, of course, obviously had to touch, so we had to have all three new moldings. The new one we're going to put at the bottom and the two opening moldings. This had come up in a staff meeting, and the engineer said we should be ready to go with that next week, and Cook says, hell, let's do it Monday. It'd be a good time to start. And so, fine. So I go downstairs, and I said, hey, we're ready to go with the new moldings. And Ken O'Donnell says, no, we're not ready to go with the new moldings. And I said, yeah, what do you mean? He said, I just talked to plant. They don't have the new molding. They got the new body side molding at the bottom. But if they put that on, the other ones are not going to touch it. There's going to be a gap in there, so they're not ready to go. It will run. Well, I said, that's nice to know. So I called, I forget who, Van Ness, I guess. And I said, we're not ready to go on that. And he says, Cook wants it done. We're going to go Monday. I said, fine, forget I even said it. So I called Betty, and I said, I got to see Mr. Cook for a minute. She said, well, come on up right now. So I went up. He said, you got a problem? I said, yeah, we can't do this Monday. And he said, well, everybody at staff said we're ready to go. And I said, we just talked to the plant, and the plant doesn't have the damn parts. They've got the lower mold. They don't have the wheel opening. Well, then let's not do it until we're ready. I said, that's all I wanted to hear you say. He said, well, why do these things get... I said, well, everybody uses your name and says, Bob Cook wants it done. And I said, I just heard it today. You want it done Monday, we're going to do it. He said, that's silly. If we haven't got the parts, we can't do it. I said, I know. He said, if you have any trouble, you let me know. And I said, no, if I have any trouble, I'll just say, well, Bob Cook said it. He said, get out of here. But, you know, we got along very well. I think at staff, sitting in on the staff meetings, Gordy and I were not the most popular guys when we sat there because of things like that. Everybody would say, everything is fine. We'd say, no, it isn't. And we'd flop something out on the table because we were involved in all the parts of the business. And I know reliability, Tommy Tompkins used to get very upset with us. He'd call us before staff started and say, what are you going to talk about today? He was very nervous that it was going to impinge and reflect on something, and he did. Dorschmer got a little bit gun shy at the end, too. But we were responsible for building the cars and filling that schedule. And if things weren't right, we weren't going to get the job done. So we used to step on hands and toes and people's heads once in a while because we figured our job was not to make friends. Our job was to get that sales job done, and to get the sales job done, you had to get the cars built that you needed. And all the talk in the world wasn't going to get that done. You had to get the, well, as we always said, get the right car at the right place at the right time. That's the only way to get the sales job done. Somebody will add now at the right price, but that's a little late for that. But it's been a fun business.
Now, what do you think about the other, like this product planning now? Did that tie in with your...
They tried to tie it into us, and I really think product planning was an absolute disaster. I think Lynn Myers, even today, the last I heard of somebody that talked to her was that she felt she really had done a very serious disservice to Oldsmobile, getting tied up in some of these product planning things that left Oldsmobile without a product. She feels very badly about it. We had some rather serious conversations when I was still working there, and she was still there, about some of these things that they were doing, and I just thought they were terrible. But she would go to these meetings at the corporation, and the gurus down there said, this is what you ought to be doing, and we spent a lot of money and a lot of time building things that didn't sell. Very unfortunate. I don't say you shouldn't have product planning, but I think the people that do the product planning, you need to have somebody in there that has even bought a car, let alone sold one. You know, dealers could give you some pretty good ideas on cars. You can't listen to all of them because you'd have a horse designed by a committee and come out as a camel type of thing. But the dealer council, you've got some very, very, very intelligent dealers who get on that national dealer council, the Faulkners of the world, the Drummies of the world, and Sam Whites of the world. These people know this business, and maybe they should be brought closer into what's going on in the forward design business. You can't always call it right. Right now we're going into another roller coaster ride on the fuel efficiency. We just turn away from smaller cars trying to go into big ones, and now we're going, you know, it's a crazy, crazy business, and you're working so far in the future that you're trapped. When you're working a minimum of 4 or 5 years in the future, how do you know what is going to be there when you get there? It's not as easy as it used to be, and I think the forward planning people have more of a challenge. I don't think there's anything wrong with the forward planning engineering end of it, but when you get into the design end of it, it's part of what I had a problem with. Trying to design these cars 4 and 5 years into the future, and then our product planning people were going off on another little tangent trying to add $1 million bumpers on a car that weren't going to give you any results. And specialty models that only sold 2,000 when your big job was to sell 500,000 or 1 million. 2,000 is nothing. It doesn't gain you anything. You spend a lot of money and a lot of time promoting something that is absolutely nothing to gain. I don't think Oldsmobile needed 7 car lines that they had when I left. You know, I was trying to kill the Forenza 2 years before they finally killed it. I said it was a waste of Oldsmobile's money. Trying to sell a car for $500 more than a Chevrolet that had nothing to offer that the Chevrolet didn't have. And most of the dealers agreed with me. That's where I picked up most of it from. The dealers wouldn't even order them. We could see that in distribution. Why do we need to promote a car that we didn't sell any of? Those are the things I think that were tough to understand in distribution. And you tried to, as I said before, in distribution, what you really wanted to do is to get the right car to the right place at the right time. And suddenly we got a car that nobody wants, and distribution is responsible for shoving it down the dealer's throat. It just stuck in our throat that we had to do business that way. We really wanted to be fair and equitable to everybody. We didn't need a car that dealers didn't want. That just gums up the distribution system and makes everybody very upset.
Did you work for fleet sales?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They had to come to us to get allocations of product, yes. So I worked with the fleet people. That was somewhat of a problem because you treated fleet better than you treated your own dealers, and that never sat well with me. But fleet wound all their cars up in the first couple months, and then they say, well, I'll see you next year. If a dealer did that to you, you'd be out there strangling him. But it was a monster that was created by the car companies, the fleet. If everybody got out of the fleet business, all the manufacturers got out of the fleet business, then it would be run on a good basis by dealers. But there was always somebody. Chrysler got into it first, giving cheaper prices to fleet than they gave to their own dealers and things like that. And it just kind of grew like Topsy and got to be a real problem.
Do you remember how many cars we'd sell in the fleet for a total year like your last year?
Oh, yeah, probably 170 or 80,000. Yeah, they would be. Depending on the car line, could amount to maybe in total 180,000 cars for the year, and most of those the fleet companies wanted right at the very beginning. So it was not it was an unpalatable way to do business. But you were damned if you did and damned if you didn't. If you didn't give them the cars, the fleet, then they just bought from somebody else, Chrysler, Ford, Foreign, or even some other division. So we used to have rather serious discussions with the fleet departments. How long can we hold these customers, our fleet customers, off? You know, we can't give them everything they want right at the beginning. So, and when you come out with a new model car and all the dealers wanted the new models and you had sold orders for new models, obviously fleet wanted the same thing, you know, and so you had to do a lot of haggling and bartering back and forth. And the cars that were not the most popular, fleet didn't want those either, so that compounded your problem. You had a lot of the less desirable cars to allocate to dealers and a shortage of the ones that were really popular. And the dealers would get to that was a discussion every year at the National Dealer Council. It was the fleet business. And I thought Maddox handled it as well as anybody did. He just said, just like I put it, he said, well, you're damned if you do it, you're damned if you don't. Do you want us to just stop doing business with fleet? Could you make up the slack and you dealers sell another 180, 200,000 cars? And most of them would say, no, I don't think so. So that business would be gone. So it wasn't the total fleet business that they objected to as much as two parts of it. They wanted the cars up front. And then when those cars came back in the used car market, they were being sold by the fleet companies on used car lots run by the fleet companies right next door to the dealer. And I don't know, it's a problem that I don't think anybody will ever come up with an answer for. The guys in the fleet department kind of turned their head and ignored that there was a problem. And unfortunately, we couldn't turn our head and ignore it. It was there, and we had to live with it. And we took a lot of heat as a division and as a corporation from dealers about the fleet business. They didn't have any better solution to it, I don't think, than we did. They just liked to talk about it and gripe about it. I don't know what you do.
Now, who were some of these big fleet?
Well, you had PH&H Company and Hertz, Avis, Alamo. Oh, most of it. Your big volume was in car rentals. Now, PH&H is a leasing company. Let's say that you and I formed a company here in Lansing, and we were going to have 20 people on the road working for us. Probably the best thing for us to do would be to contact somebody like McCullough Leasing or PH&H and lease 20 cars for those representatives to drive. And at the end of the period of time, we just turn them back into McCullough. We paid a monthly rental, and they dispose of the cars. You and I don't have to fool with it. That's the leasing end of the business.
And does the leasing company handle the insurance?
Oh, everything. Sometimes they'll even handle the service. If they're a real big company, they'll even have a service contract where you take the car to lubricate it, oil, change tires, rotate, everything else. There are many kinds of leases. There's full service lease, there's minimum lease, open-ended lease. You can lease a car and you have to dispose of it at the end, and then you pay off a balloon note to the company. Or that's an open-ended lease. A closed-end lease, you just turn it back into them and then they dispose of the car. All kinds of different lease operations. The daily rental companies, of course, were the biggest ones because they bought in the biggest numbers. Down in Florida, during the winter, they would buy just tons of cars, and Hertz, Avis, and one time we sold them, what was that, in 1986, I think, coming into the fall of '86. We wrote up a contract to sell 15,098 Oldsmobiles, all going to Florida at the same time. And that was we got involved in that one. It was a last-minute deal, and we had to strip all the orders out of the Orion plant, get the plant manager to agree to start new orders down the system. We had to get some of them trucked all the way to Florida to get there within the deadline. But it was 15,000 cars all in one fell swoop. You can't turn down that kind of business. And even our dealers who complained about it would not, if sitting in the same seat, would have said, go for it. You don't sell 15,000 cars like that very often. And they all went down to Florida, and they were all over Florida for about 3 or 4 months.
Do the leasing companies pretty much go for the larger cars?
No, they want a mix of each, but they had a special deal going at that time with General Motors on C-body cars. So they wanted 98s, they wanted Cadillac DeVilles, and they wanted Buick Park Avenues. But we were the only one that was able to respond that fast. So we got a lot of flack from the corporation later on. It was supposed to be 30% Oldsmobile, 30% Buick, and 40% Cadillac. We ended up getting 75% of the business because we were the only ones that were able to respond, to build them that fast. Buick hemmed and hawed a little too long, and the deadline to try to get them orders into the plant had passed. Cadillac kind of said, well, we'll get the business anyway, so they lost, and they were mad, very mad. But we were the only ones that took the orders that day, called the plant, and had them strip all the orders out of the line, got everybody to do what they had to do right away. So it worked out for us.
Did you work with Ed Mertz when he was there?
No. He came in with the BOC reorganization. The only thing was that when he was there, Ed Vogt, of course, moved over to the BOC thing, and he said, I sit in these staff meetings like we used to have under our old Oldsmobile, and these people don't know anything about the sales end of the business. They never hear anything about the sales end of the business. Would you come up once a month and put on what you used to do for our staff, only on a monthly basis, and try to cover Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and Buick? The individual 3 cars we're building here, plus the overall sales picture, and maybe anything else that would be of interest. So I said, yeah, I'd love to. So Ed Vogt would let me know what time he wanted me to be on the next day, and it was once a month I'd go up and put on what he called the Dog and Pony Show, and Ed Mertz was chairman of the thing at the time. He was in charge of the BOC. And so I would do that once a month. And Ed thought that was a good idea, to let them know what's going on the sales side of the business. He said, they kind of, and this is how sales-minded Ed had gotten over the years. I'd mentioned that he wasn't to begin with. He said, if we don't sell cars, we don't need to build them. And so I would go up there, and of course a lot of the people I knew because they had been here and just gone over to BOC. But so I would put on a 20-minute presentation once a month. When Mertz left, and Hackworth came back, continued it for a little while. And then when Ed Vogt retired, they didn't do it anymore. Neither Melky nor Tom Medill do that anymore. They just kind of, they lost interest in it up there, which I think is sad. I think they need to know a little more about what's going on in the sales end of the business.
What about Doug Tracy? Did you work with him?
No, very, very little, really. I just saw him at staff meetings and stuff. Doug and I never got along very well. We had a really big falling out one time about something he wanted us to do, changing over at Fisher Body, and I wasn't involved in the production side of the business. Doug at that time was working in production control, and he wanted us to do something over at Fisher Body, and our people, Ken O'Donnell and Poindexter and all those guys, had already talked to the guys at Fisher Body, and they said, we don't want any part of that. Tracy was adamant, we're going to do it this way. I said, fine. He says, we're going to go over to Fisher Body and have a meeting. I got to set up for 1 o'clock. I said, fine. So we got in his car and we all went over to Fisher Body. And he went through this big long song and dance and everything else, and the guys from Fisher said, it looks pretty good, Doug. We don't think we want to do it. He just exploded. And we got in the car on the way back, and I said, well, we could have told you that, but you don't listen. You could have told me why. I said, they didn't want to do it. He said, that's your idea of what you wanted to do, and Fisher Body doesn't want anything to do with the thing. He said, you ought to do a little more research. So he was very cold with me from then on, but I don't know what I forget what it was he wanted to do, but it was something about sequencing orders and everything in a way that it ought to be done on some theory that he had, and I don't know whether it had ever been tried before, but it wasn't worth trying. He got very upset with me. No, I didn't get along with Doug.
Now, did you work with Mr. White, Jack White? That was...
Well, Jack was around, sure. Yeah, I've known everybody to some degree. Jack was probably, was he still there when I came in '69? I don't remember now. Yeah, I think he was, sure, he was still there for a while, and Fritz was his assistant, sure. Yeah.
Well, you worked with Mr. Bennett.
Oh, sure. Yeah. We never really had any, I guess we never had a great deal of direct contact with the public relations department. Probably talked to you more than I talked to anybody else out there, really.
What about your contact with the budget department?
Never much. No, we lived within our budget. We're the only department, sales analysis distribution, lived within their budget every year. And I think, as far as I know, we're the only one that ever did that, so they didn't bother us at all. Never had any problem with them.
But you worked closely then with the service people, service department, like Stebbins?
No.
Really?
No. The only time we worked with the service department, I'd say, we were kind of on our own. The only time we worked with other departments is if we got a call from a dealer and had something to do with something else outside of our department, we went to that department to get it handled for him. We never turned anybody down and said, no, go call somebody else. We handled anything that, well, you did that in the field, so we did it at Lansing. In the field, the car distributor was, well, somebody told me one time, said, you're the fender man. And I said, well, what do you mean? It was one of our dealers in Detroit. And he said, well, you're the car distributor. I was brand new in Detroit. I'd come back up from Cincinnati. And it was Ray Sievers, a dealer in Detroit, Shore Sievers Company. He said, well, my brother, years ago, used to be a car distributor for Packard Motor Company. He said, they always called him the fender man. So why the fender man? Oh, he said, the fenders pick up all the crap from the wheels. And I said, well, we did that. Yeah. We did that in the field, so that's the way we did it at Lansing. And so the only time we really had any direct dealings with Stebbins or any of the people in the service department is we had a dealer had a service problem, and he couldn't get it handled locally. I'd call Ivan and say, something's gone wrong with the line of communication. Maybe the man needs some help. And it wasn't part of our business, but we made it part of our business, because if somebody calls, he's got a reason to call. He didn't pick up the phone just to be a nuisance. He picked up the phone because he's got a problem. So we stuck our nose into a lot of people's business that we probably shouldn't have. But we did it for the right reason, yeah. Oh, we had relations with a customer going on for 6 months on his '98 Oldsmobile through 5 different kinds of repairs. We did it personally, and we got to be on a first-name basis with the customer. But, it was one of those calls that was going to Joe Sanchez. And Betty headed it off, or Helen, I guess, headed it off. And when she'd have one of those calls, she thought was something that the guy would be very upset if he got one of these, let us get back to you, sir. Instead of going over to the owner relations, she'd send them down to me. And a lot of that whole started because of shortages of cars. When we first came out with a certain car model, and all these people start writing letters to the general manager about, I want to get my car built, when can you help me? Well, she'd shuttle those down to me. So then that kind of grew like Topsy, and it got to be if we got a really irate customer about something, and Sanchez, she wasn't going to put it through to Sanchez, and she knew Maddox didn't want to talk to him, or the two assistant generals weren't there. Let Tom do it. So I'd end up talking to them. Sig Shore, if I went into his store today, probably he'd take me to lunch. He's an arms and antique dealer in north of Chicago. But he had a car, and he had a problem with his car, and it was our damn fault that he had the problem. The car was built at Orion, and the dealer and the zone and everybody told him he was out of his mind, but he tried to change a tire on his car, and he had a locking lug nut on the car painted red. And that's not an option that's on an Oldsmobile 98. But he couldn't get the thing off because it required a special wrench. The car was built, and as it was going down the line at Orion, somebody didn't look up to see that it was an Olds instead of a Cadillac, and put a set of Cadillac locking nuts on all four wheels, and off it went. Now, he tells his dealer, and the dealer says, well, we'll weld another nut on there and back that off. And he said, well, you're going to do it on all four of them? Well, it's going to cost you. He said, not going to cost me anything. This car came from the factory this way. So off we went into this. And so he finally got a hold of me, and he started telling me the story. I said, give me your phone number. And he said, I'll get somebody from the zone to contact you. I called the Chicago zone. I said, get somebody out there. I said, the guy can't change his damn tires. They said, that's impossible. I said, no, it's not impossible. Just get somebody out there. I said, okay. So I called Ivan Stebbins. I said, I just had an interesting conversation. The guy's got locking lug nuts on his 98. Ivan says, that's impossible. I said, no, it's not impossible. Let's go down to the garage. And we went down to the garage, Maddox's car and four other cars parked in the inside garage of staff. When we popped the hubcaps, they had locking nuts on there. They'd been built at Orion the same damn way. I said, now do you realize we got a problem? All of a sudden, everybody got very excited. So we had to go to a Cadillac dealer, had the people from Chicago buy the special wrench, and the guy said, he called me back, said, boy, you sure handled that for me, Mr. Smith. And I said, well, fine, why not? And he says, the nice thing about I got locking things on here that didn't cost me a cent. I said, oh, by the way, we're going to send you an invoice. He says, don't get smart. So then he had a couple other problems on the car. We had to send out some other stuff. But one part he couldn't get, and I had to call Van Peters over at GM Parts. And Van said, what do you want? Where do you want it? I'd known Van for as long as I'd worked for Oldsmobile, probably. No problem. Like that. The parts are up there. He even wanted to change dealers because he was so mad at his dealer for not giving him good service. I said, well, I can't recommend another dealer. So I got Bud Melky on the phone, who'd come in from Chicago. I said, Sigmund Shore, Bud Melky, and they're talking on the phone. Bud said, I can't recommend. And he said, well, I want to go to another dealer. He said, how about so-and-so? Bud said, fine. So he went there, and Bud said he picked a good one. He got rid of the guy that was the lowest CSI in the United States is the one he bought his car from. The one I said it was at the very bottom of the whole United States. And then they had a terrible, they dented his car while they were in there trying to do something with these lug nuts that were wrong. And, oh. So anyway, I asked Bud the other day, when last time I saw him, any more conversation with Sig Shore lately? He said, well, you'd be surprised to know that Sigmund has bought an Oldsmobile for his wife, and his brother-in-law even bought an Oldsmobile. He never had an Oldsmobile in the whole damn family. That one he bought was the first one. And if we had shut him off,
that would have been his last.
That would have been his last. That's right. Spent a lot of time talking to him and doing things, but it pays off. Always.
Tom, there were two things. You mentioned you had originated the selector unit.
Yes, ordering system. Mm-hmm.
There was another thing at the first part of the interview that you really felt you'd made a contribution to, some type of distribution.
Oh, that's the distribution system that they're currently using, which is.
Those were two marvelous contributions. Is there any other contribution of significance you can think of?
Oh, no, I don't. I think those are the two major ones that I can think of. There might have been some little changes that we did in the distribution or forecasting or something, but nothing that I would think was that original. I've had some other ideas, I suppose, over time that we ended up using at one time or another, but those were major projects. It took some time and effort to develop, that I think was time well spent in both cases. Yeah.
Well, you've really given us a turn.
Well, I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did.
Can you think of anything else you'd like to add, Tom, about your years at Oldsmobile Oldsmobile, and you had 37, you said.
38. 38, yeah.
Mhm.
No, I can't think of anything at the moment. Bob Cook every once in a while would start to talk about somebody like his old roommate, Warren McElhaney, the GMI. I said, I know Warren. He said, how do you know Warren? I said, I worked in the Omaha zone for 4 years. I said, oh, yeah, I keep forgetting you've been all over the place. But Cook used to get a kick because he'd try to remember somebody's name, and I could usually come up with it, And then he said, boy, you go back a long ways. And I said, well, 1950 is quite a ways back with Oldsmobile. But I knew a lot of people over the years. And I've always had a pretty good memory. To be a good car distributor, you had a good memory.
Well,
You had to. You had to remember. They used to kid me about remembering all the dealer code numbers in the zone after I'd been there about 2 weeks. And I said, I can still remember some of the code numbers in the Detroit zone.
7.
Oh, Zone 7, yeah. Oh, I can still remember some of them,
Let me
yeah.
ask you, when you retired in 87, how many zones did we have then?
We had 26. Yeah.
At one time, we had 28. Did we ever?
I think we had 28 at one time, yeah, when Newark was still working, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Des Moines, didn't we have a Des Moines?
The Des Moines zone was closed and moved to Omaha in 1952, I think, somewhere back in there. Yeah, it's somewhere in that area. That was just migrated over to Omaha.
And we have 6 regions.
Not anymore. Actually, they did away with regional managers now. Now we don't have regional managers. You have assistant general sales managers in the field, and there are 4 of those. And they've got the country split up into 4 regional areas, I guess you'd call
What are
them.
they?
There's an Atlantic.
Who's the regional manager?
Well, Larry Tierney in the Atlantic, and then there's a Central, which is Ted Madzia.
Okay.
And then you've got a Midwest, and that's Bill Johnston. And now there's a problem. Right at the moment, we have 2 guys in the western part. You've got John Martabano, who currently is on the West Coast, and really Bob Holdsworth hasn't really cleared out of Dallas yet. So there's going to be one area that's West Coast and that western part. But right now you got 2 men with a similar title.
I see.
And I think that Bob Holdsworth is supposed to retire in February, and he was going to come in here and work a little while, and then he had a heart problem, and he was back in the hospital again yesterday. In fact, he had to go through another balloon treatment. So he is neither fish nor fowl at the moment, and Martabano is only at the moment handling the 2 zones on the West Coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles. But I think the plan was to move that headquarters from Dallas to Los Angeles and cover the whole West. So there'll be 4 areas anyway. And the zones are down to, I don't know what we've got now, 16 or so.
16 zones?
14 to 16, yeah. Down quite a ways.
Well,
Yeah.
and what was it? We said we had 26.
26, yeah. But that was part of the plan, was that when they put dealers on they took the dealers off the direct contact and put them on ODAC, where they're contacted by phone. Any dealer that was below 100 car a year planning potential or sales potential or whatever, they were going to directly contact that dealer by phone unless he was sitting right next to or on a direct line to a couple of large points, and then they'd still contact him directly with an individual. So a lot of the dealers, I think probably better than half the dealers are now on the ODAC system, but they account for only 10% of our business, but they're spread all over, the western Nebraskas and the Montanas and the Dakotas. Very small dealer points are no longer contacted directly by an individual. Don't drive up in the car and shake hands anymore. They do it by phone. But all the, not all, I don't know about Cadillac, but Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, and Olds have gone to this system of dealer contact. Whether it will prove to be advantageous is still up for vote.
How many dealers do we have now?
Last I know, 3,200.
That's maintained itself
Pretty much so, yeah. I don't know. I always thought that direct contact was the only way to do business. The phone leaves something to be desired. And in the points where we had direct contact, and there were Chevrolet duels, or an awful lot of Chevrolet duels that sold more Oldsmobiles than Chevrolets, only because they really liked the Oldsmobile people that contacted them.
Well,
And that's all gone, see.
Yeah.
That's all, you blow that right out the window.
What about these duels with
Isuzu or...
Foreign? Well, nothing you can do about that. And maybe right today it's a blessing they've got them. Because if they were Oldsmobile exclusive, there are some awfully big dealers around this country that are losing tremendous amounts of money. Carl Story isn't too happy right now either. He's got Nissan, but he can't pick up the slack of what he was doing with Oldsmobile. Very unhappy individual.
It's kind of a transitory position, right?
Oh yeah, I bite my tongue when I talk to him. I always felt like saying, he's upset because a lot of people in Lansing that buy cars now buy them in other places. I always tempted to say, except that I don't really want to upset him, and I think he knows what I would say anyway, is you should have started back in the 50s, treated the Oldsmobile employee customers better. They would still be with you. Oh, they were going to do that out here when the guy that was here before Regency, what was his name?
Starneman?
No, before Starneman. They bought Starneman out. Anyway, that was one of his big things. He told Fred Hosworth, he said, I'm going to go in there, and he said, I'm going to lure a lot of these customers away from Story by really treating them like a class act. He never did. Great to say, but he didn't.
But you got to back it up.
Sure. So you got University Story and now Regency. They're probably only doing half the business they could be doing with employee sales because they've irritated some of the employees over the years. And now you don't have to, you can buy your car any way you want, anywhere you want. There's no restriction anymore. It used to be a 20-mile restriction, which protected them a little bit. But I still buy a car. I don't have nothing against Carl. I've known him for, I guess, since '57. And used to do business with he and Frank Crippen. And I have nothing against him. And when I go over there, they treat me very well. I know Doug Melberry. I know the sales manager, so why would I go somewhere else to buy a car? If I'd had a serious problem with them, I'd go somewhere else. I don't go up to Regency anymore. They treated my wife so shabbily out there and trying to order parts for her car, I just said, well, we're not going to buy there anymore.
One experience does it.
Well, they did it 2 different times. I left the car there once, and we were going out of town and left her car to have them rotate the tires and do something and this and that, and we got back and they hadn't even touched it. And then they had to order a couple parts, and they ordered the wrong part 3 times in a row. Just a simple sill panel. So I just said to Bob, I said, forget it. I said, I don't need this kind of a hassle. I was still working at that time. So I said, I'm going to start going over the Story. But I take her car over now. I get more time on my hands than she does, and I take it over there. And of course, I can usually borrow Carl's car to go somewhere so I don't. It's not a total waste of time, and it works out very well. So.
Oh, gee, this has been a great interview, Tom, and it's been very nice
well,
seeing you.
good seeing you too. We don't get together very often anymore, except every